There is a moment in the hour before dawn when the world seems to hold its breath, when mist clings to the earth and sounds become both louder and more distant at once. Imagine yourself in such a moment, standing in a field somewhere in the German interior during the early 1920s. The ground beneath your feet is damp and heavy with dew. Off to your left, you can hear the measured rhythm of boots, many boots, in formation, moving through the haze, with a precision that speaks of countless hours spent learning the same movements, the same timing, the same exact way of being a soldier. The air tastes faintly of metal and rust. There is the smell of clean wool and leather, and somewhere beneath it all, the sharper scent of machine oil and the faint acidity of gunpowder residue, even though no shots have been fired, at least not yet. If you find yourself drifting off to quiet, detailed stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe. It is the simplest way to make sure the next long journey through the story of Schwerpunkt Doctrine, how Germany built its Blitzkrieg, WW2, finds its way back to you. This is Germany, in the years immediately following the First World War, a nation that has been told it must forget how to be what it once was. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919, had carved through German military power like a surgeon's blade. The nation that had fielded millions of men just months before was now permitted an army of exactly 100,000 soldiers. No tanks, no air force, no submarines, no general staff. The armaments factories that had worked around the clock throughout the war were being dismantled or repurposed. And yet, in fields like the one you stand in now, officers in grey uniforms continued to move through the darkness, thinking. They continued to plan. They continued to imagine a different future, even though the world believed that future had been permanently foreclosed. What you are witnessing in this moment, though you may not fully understand it yet, is the birth of something entirely new. Not new in the sense that it had never been imagined before. History does not work that way. But new in the sense that it was being forged in secret, in stolen hours, by men who understood that their nation's survival might depend on finding an entirely different way to wage war than the way that had nearly destroyed them all. If you find yourself drawn into the architecture of how military doctrine is built, how ideas are whispered among officers and then gradually become the shape of entire nations' strategies, you might consider following this story through to its ending. This channel has woven together the full narrative of the Schwerpunkt Doctrine and the slow birth of what would become known as Blitzkrieg, and it may offer you the kind of thorough exploration that settles the mind before sleep, the way certain stories do when they unfold their logic patiently and without rush. The sun has not yet risen in this field. The officers continue their movements. The mist refuses to lift, and the question that hangs in the cold air is this: how does a nation, stripped of its weapons and its pride, rebuild itself in secret? How does it transform defeat into something that might, just perhaps, become victory? To understand what happened in these fields, and what would eventually unfold across an entire continent, you must first understand what had come before. The Great War, as it was called then, had consumed an entire generation. It had begun in 1914 with cavalry charges and romantic notions of glory, and it had ended in 1918 with millions of bodies buried in the mud of trenches that seemed to stretch across the known world. The Western Front, particularly, had become a kind of industrial machine for the grinding away of human life. Men advanced across no man's land and were cut down by machine guns. Men died in the thousands to take a piece of ground that was abandoned days later. Artillery bombardments lasted for weeks, turning the landscape into something from a nightmare, a place where the earth itself seemed to have turned against the living. Germany had fought in this war with particular intensity, and the nation had lost. But how it had lost was almost as important as the fact of losing itself. The German army, by many accounts, was still in the field, still fighting, when the armistice was declared on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. There had been no foreign soldiers on German soil. The homeland had not been invaded, and yet, in the months that followed, a revolution had swept through Germany from the streets. Mutinies had broken out. Workers' councils had formed, and suddenly, A military that had seemed invincible to itself was being disbanded, its soldiers sent home, its structure shattered. The officers who survived this transformation, those who had lived through the trenches and somehow endured, were left with a peculiar problem. They could not forget what they had experienced. They could not unknow what they had learned about the futility of the tactics that had sent millions to their deaths. Trench warfare, at least as it had been conducted, was something that could never work again, or so many of them believed. The machine gun had made the frontal assault obsolete. Artillery, with its capacity to destroy everything and kill nothing of value, had made the static defense almost equally problematic. Something had to change. But what? The men in this misty field represent one answer to that question. They were part of something called the Reichswehr, the armed force that Germany was permitted to maintain under the terms of Versailles. 100,000 men spread across the entire nation, not enough to wage war against any serious opponent, but enough, perhaps, if those men were selected carefully, trained relentlessly, and organized according to principles that were entirely different from anything that had come before. There is a name that will recur throughout this story, and it is worth introducing now, even in the darkness of this pre-dawn field. Hans von Seeckt, General Hans von Seeckt. He was not a young man when the war ended, and he had not been a junior officer cowering in the trenches. By the time the armistice came, von Seeckt was already a senior staff officer, a man schooled in the old traditions of the Prussian military. And yet, in many ways, he understood that the old traditions would not survive. The nation that had been built on the idea of Prussian military glory could not return to that. It had to evolve, or it would disappear entirely. The boots you hear in the mist belong to soldiers who will, in a decade's time, fight in a way that the world has never quite seen before. Not yet, though. Not in this moment. In this moment, they are simply training. They are learning to move with precision. They are learning to think about terrain in a particular way. They are learning about the relationship between the position of one unit and the position of another, about how information moves between officers, about how decisions cascade down through a chain of command. They are learning to be different, and they do not quite know yet why, or where this path will lead. The question that the officers in this field are attempting to answer, though they might not phrase it in these exact words, is this. If you cannot win through attrition, if you cannot win by grinding down your enemy through waves of frontal assault, how do you win? What does victory look like when the old formulas have all failed? The mist thickens slightly as the minutes pass. The sound of the boots continues, steady and patient. And somewhere in the minds of the men moving through this darkness, an idea is forming, an idea that will gradually become clearer and more defined, an idea about concentration and maneuver, about finding the weak point in your enemy's armor and hitting it with everything you have, all at once, before they can reinforce it. It is an idea that has older roots than anyone might immediately recognize, but it will be given new form in this era, new urgency, new technological possibility. This is the beginning of the story. This is the moment before the idea has fully crystallized, before it has a name, before anyone truly understands what it will eventually become. The field is cold, the mist is impenetrable, the future is still unwritten, though the pen is already in motion. This section should ease the listener from the cold opening directly into the invitation to follow this specific story. It needs to bridge from the sensory opening moment into intellectual curiosity, introduce the concept of Schwerpunkt and Blitzkrieg as intriguing intellectual puzzles, establish why this story matters and why it unfolds as it does. Place one subscribe invitation, softly woven around this specific topic. Create a sense of intimate companionship for the listener's journey ahead. Set expectations for what will unfold in the stretches to come. Use narrative color while maintaining accuracy. Deploy gentle questions and reflections. Maintain sleep cadence and long, flowing rhythm. There is a story here, not a simple one of triumph or villainy, but rather a story of how men sitting in quiet rooms, with nothing but ink and paper and centuries of military thought before them, began to sketch out an entirely new way of waging war, a way that would reshape the 20th century. And if you're curious about how an idea builds, how a doctrine grows from whispers and study into something that changes the course of nations, if you want to follow that slow, patient work of thought, becoming steel and motion, then let's walk through it together. The journey we're about to undertake moves through nearly 2 decades of hidden effort, through the wreckage of one world war and into the design of another, through the constraint of peace treaties and secret rooms, through the careful study of failure and the audacious reimagining of what an army could become. It is the story of how a small group of German officers, working in the shadow of defeat, began to ask themselves a deceptively simple question: what if we stopped trying to win through brute force and endless lines, and instead learned to win through speed, precision, and the calculated concentration of overwhelming power at one decisive point? That question, that single shift in thinking, would eventually give birth to something the world would come to know as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a method of combat that seemed to strike with almost supernatural coordination, where tanks and aircraft and infantry moved together as if guided by a single intelligence. But before it became a myth, before it became the fearsome reputation that echoes through history textbooks, it was simply an idea, a doctrine, a careful architecture built piece by piece. And this is where the real fascination lives. Not in the explosions or the speed or the legendary panzer formations rolling across the continent, but in the quieter story underneath. The story of how officers in the 20s, stripped of their weapons and their international standing, began to rebuild something entirely new from the ashes of the old. How they read, how they thought, how they argued in staff colleges and studied the mistakes of a previous generation, how they looked at the battlefields of the last war, those frozen, grinding years of trench and artillery and stalemate, and decided that there had to be another way. The doctrine itself carries a name that often gets translated simply as point of main effort, but the German word Schwerpunkt is richer than that. It contains within it the idea of weight, of gravity, of the single point where all force converges. It is a concept that reaches back into centuries of military philosophy, but it was the Germans who would eventually weaponize it, who would turn it from an abstract principle into a method that could break through defenses, collapse armies, and overturn the assumed rules of modern warfare. If you would like to follow this unfolding in its fullness, to move through each careful step as this doctrine was born and shaped and tested, we invite you to subscribe so that as new stretches of this story arrive, you can continue the journey from precisely where it left off. There is much more ground to walk, but for now, understand this. We are about to move backward in time, past the panic of the Blitzkrieg campaigns, past the invasion of France and the lightning strike across Poland. We are going to descend into the 20s and 30s, into the Weimar years, into the secret work of a military that was forbidden by international treaty to maintain the kind of army it dreamed of. We are going to meet the men who thought their way around those restrictions, who studied their enemies, the British theorists of mobile warfare, the Soviets with their own radical tank experiments, their own dreams of rapid maneuver. We are going to trace how an idea moves through the world, how it grows in conversation and in study, how it hardens into doctrine, and how doctrine eventually becomes the shape of the future itself. The field we began in is not the end of this story, it is only the beginning. And as we walk deeper into this history, as we watch officers and theorists and engineers all contribute their piece to the puzzle, notice how slowly this transformation occurs, how patient it is, how deliberate. There is a lesson in that patience, a rhythm, and perhaps, as you follow along, you'll find yourself moving deeper into the narrative, the way one moves deeper into sleep, without quite noticing the transition, until you're already there. The guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and in that sudden quietude, something fundamental shifted beneath the surface of European civilization. For 4 years, an entire continent had been locked in a war of attrition, so vast and so terrible that entire generations were measured not in years, but in the seasons of their consumption. Millions had fallen into the mud of the Somme, at Verdun, along the Isonzo, in the trenches that carved the land into an open wound. And when it ended, not with a bang, but with an armistice, the victors found themselves exhausted, hollow, uncertain whether they had truly won or simply survived. Germany, though, faced something different. The armistice came not as relief, but as rupture. For the generals and officers who had sustained the war effort, defeat felt like incomprehension. The front had not been breached in any decisive way. German territory itself had barely been touched. How could they have lost? This question would echo through German military circles for years to come, spawning legends and resentments that would shape the next 2 decades. The stab-in-the-back myth took root easily in soil already prepared by confusion and national trauma. But beneath the political convulsions and the wounded pride, there was a practical catastrophe unfolding. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919, did not merely end the war. It attempted to remake the map of Europe and to permanently cripple Germany's ability to wage war ever again. The treaty was, in the estimation of many observers then and historians since, a document of stunning punitive intent. Germany lost territory to Poland, to France, to Denmark, to Lithuania. The Rhineland became a demilitarized zone. The Saar was placed under League of Nations control. The colonial empire, which had existed more in aspiration than reality, was stripped away entirely. But the military provisions were what cut deepest into the heart of German strategic capability. The army, the Reichswehr, was to be limited to 100,000 men. 100,000. Consider that for a moment. This was a nation of 60 million people, a nation that had fielded armies in the millions just months before, and now it was permitted barely a fraction of what even the smallest major power might consider adequate for national defense. The officer corps was limited to 4,000 men, meaning that an entire generation of junior officers and NCOs would have to be discharged, casting out the very men who had learned their trade through years of the most intensive warfare imaginable. The navy was reduced to almost nothing, a surface fleet so small it could hardly be called an instrument of national power. Submarines were forbidden entirely. An air force was prohibited outright. No tanks were permitted, no poison gas, no heavy artillery beyond a narrow range. Germany was to be a nation with only a constabulary, a police force masquerading as an army, incapable of serious offensive operations and barely adequate even for territorial defense. The intent was crystalline. The architects of Versailles had looked at German military power and had decided that it must be dismantled, that it could not be allowed to rise again. What they could not have anticipated, though, was how deeply this humiliation would provoke a response that transcended mere rearmament. The constraint itself became generative. Forced into a prison of their own making, a small circle of German officers began to think differently about warfare itself. If you cannot have numbers, what else do you have? If you cannot field armies of millions, how do you defeat armies of millions? If you are bound by treaty and watched by international observers, how do you reimagine military power itself? These were not theoretical questions posed in comfortable rooms. They were urgent, pressing, questions that touched on national survival. The officers who would shape German military doctrine through the 1920s and into the 1930s understood that Versailles was not permanent, that it was a document written by men in the flush of victory, and that such documents could be rewritten or torn up by nations with the will to do so. But rewriting alone would not suffice. To overcome the numerical superiority that potential adversaries, France above all, possessed, Germany would need to think in ways that previous generations had not been forced to think. The shattered remnants of the war machine that had nearly conquered Europe now had to be reconceived from first principles. What was war, really? Was it the accumulation of bodies, the grinding attrition of resources, the slow advance across terrain? Or could it be something else? Could it be a rapier thrust instead of a bludgeon? Could it be speed instead of mass? Could it be intelligence instead of overwhelming force? These questions bubbled up in the minds of a generation of officers who had survived the trenches and who now found themselves forced to imagine something radically different. The officers themselves were unusual in another way. The war had burned away the old aristocratic cavalry traditions and the rigid hierarchies that had sometimes characterized pre-war German military culture. In the Reichswehr that emerged from the treaty, there was an emphasis on educated, thinking officers who could understand not just tactics, but the broader principles of warfare. The NCOs and junior officers were carefully selected, retained from among the hundreds of thousands who had to be discharged, chosen for their intelligence and their capacity to think independently. This was the stage upon which the next act would unfold. Germany was broken, humiliated, constrained by treaty, watched by the world, and yet paradoxically free to reimagine itself entirely. The Reichswehr, though tiny, was to become something new, not a larger version of the old army, but something that had to be fundamentally different in concept. The officer corps was, in a sense, given a gift, wrapped in the ribbon of defeat. They had to think from scratch about what an army could be when it could not rely on the traditional measures of military power. They had to discover something else. What emerged from this forced reinvention would eventually reshape the entire character of warfare in the 20th century. But that transformation could not happen in public. It had to be hidden. It had to unfold in classified studies and secret exercises and disguised programs. The Treaty of Versailles had tried to impose permanence on German weakness, but it had inadvertently created the conditions for one of the most radical reimaginings of military doctrine that history would witness. The constraint, paradoxically, was the beginning of revolution. In the years immediately after Versailles, Germany faced not merely military defeat, but an extraordinary constraint. The treaty had prescribed the shape of the German army with almost surgical precision. 100,000 men, no general staff, no heavy artillery, no aircraft, no tanks. It was meant to make Germany militarily harmless, and yet, in the corridors of a modest building in Berlin, officers began to think in ways that would, within 2 decades, reshape the character of warfare itself. The place they gathered was called the Truppenamt, the troop office. On paper, it was merely an administrative body, a way of organizing training and logistics without violating the letter of Versailles, which had forbidden a general staff by name. But in practice, the Truppenamt became something far more consequential. It was an act of intellectual defiance, cloaked in bureaucratic necessity. German officers, stripped of the resources to build armies, turned instead to the architecture of thought itself. They could not build tanks, but they could imagine them. They could not train divisions, but they could study the principles that would one day coordinate them. This was not resignation. This was transformation through constraint. At the center of this quiet rebellion stood Hans von Seeckt, a man whose name has largely faded from popular memory, though his influence persists in every modern military doctrine that speaks of concentrated force and decisive maneuver. Seeckt was not a figure of romantic or flamboyant gesture. He was precise, almost austere in his demeanor. Where other officers might have raged against the humiliations of Versailles, Seeckt accepted them as the starting point for something entirely new. In a letter from the time, he wrote words that seemed almost paradoxical, that with fewer men, one might accomplish more, not through mere courage or desperation, but through superior thought. The officers who gathered around him in the Truppenamt understood something that many military establishments of the era had not yet grasped. The age of the line, the endless trenches, the grinding attrition that had consumed millions, had failed not because it lacked courage, but because it lacked a center. Every point along a defensive line carried equal weight. An army distributed evenly across 10 miles of front was an army that could be overwhelmed at any point where sufficient force was concentrated. What Seeckt and his colleagues began to formulate, in secret papers and restricted circulation journals, was the inverse proposition. What if the entire weight of an army's effort could be concentrated at a single, carefully chosen point? What if, instead of a broad front of steady pressure, one created a spearhead? This was not entirely new thinking, though in the 1920s it required almost heretical conviction to propose it seriously. The mobile campaigns of the Eastern Front in World War I had hinted at such possibilities. Russian and German forces, operating across vast distances and with less developed trench systems, had achieved victories through maneuver and local concentration. General Alexei Brusilov's offensive of 1916 had demonstrated that a carefully orchestrated breakthrough at a decisive point could pierce an entire front. But these lessons had been largely buried beneath the suffocating weight of the Western Front's stalemate. German officers, bound by Versailles restrictions from building new weapons or large-scale units, were free, in a strange way, to think without constraint. They could ask questions that seemed almost absurd given the circumstances. How would one fight if forced to move fast? What if immobility itself, the curse of the trenches, became the fundamental problem to solve? The Truppenamt became, in effect, a vast intellectual workshop. Officers studied military history with a rigor that approached obsession. They analyzed not just German campaigns, but Russian, French, and British operations. They examined the mobile warfare of earlier centuries, the campaigns of Frederick the Great, the maneuvering of Napoleonic armies. They conducted exercises on paper, imagining small elite units operating with speed and coordination across terrain. It was theoretical work, constrained by the very poverty of resources that should have made it meaningless, and yet it was also utterly serious. Siecht insisted on one principle above all others: the officer corps must be maintained at a high level of intellectual and technical competence. Every man retained in the 100,000-strong Reichswehr was selected not merely for loyalty or service record, but for the potential to command larger forces. In a sense, the German officer corps of the 1920s was being preserved like a carefully maintained library. Each man was a repository of knowledge and capacity that might one day expand outward. The Truppenamt conducted its work with a kind of institutional discretion that bordered on the theatrical. The restrictions of Versailles were technically observed while being circumvented in spirit. Manuals were published under innocuous titles, circulated only to officers. Cavalry units, which were explicitly permitted under the treaty terms, were studied as the prototype for mobile forces. What qualities made cavalry effective? Speed, concentration, the ability to strike at a weak point. These characteristics could apply equally well to motorized forces, once motors became available. It was a kind of intellectual judo, using the constraints themselves as leverage to think in radically new directions. Officers within the Truppenamt engaged in a sustained conversation with the strategic and tactical writings of Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian theorist whose work had been canonical in German military education since the 19th century. Clausewitz had emphasized the importance of finding the enemy's decisive point, the center of gravity where commitment of force would produce the greatest effect. He had written of the friction of war, the way that even the best-laid plans encountered unexpected resistance and delay. And he had emphasized mobility, what he called the principle of concentration in time rather than space. One could defeat a larger force if one could concentrate one's own strength at the decisive moment, in the decisive place. The Truppenamt officers recognized that Clausewitz had provided, a century earlier, the theoretical foundation for everything they were now beginning to construct. The work was slow and painstaking. There was no sense of urgency at first, no clear indication that these theories would ever be implemented on a large scale. The Truppenamt existed in a kind of liminal space between the defeated present and an uncertain future. The officers gathered there could not have known that within 15 years they would oversee the rearmament of Germany, or that within 20 years their theories would be tested in actual combat. They worked as scholars and theorists because that was all that was permitted, and in that constraint, paradoxically, they gained something. They thought more deeply, more critically, more thoroughly than perhaps they would have if resources had been unlimited and implementation always possible. Theory became not a luxury but a necessity, and in that necessity lay the seeds of something genuinely innovative. The Truppenamt's work in the 1920s represented a kind of quiet determination to preserve not just the German military, but German military thinking itself. It was an act of intellectual resistance conducted entirely within legal bounds, entirely on paper, entirely in the realm of theory and study. The soldiers who conducted this work were constrained by Versailles, but within those constraints, they were also liberated. They could ask what kind of army Germany ought to have, not what army Germany had. They could imagine, and in imagining, they could begin to build. In the shadows of this careful reconstruction, one man's vision would crystallize all the fervent discussions, the secret memoranda, the late-night strategic conversations, into something far more refined and deliberate. Hans von Ziegt, a Prussian officer of the old school, understood something that many military minds of his era had either forgotten or refused to acknowledge: that sheer mass, that overwhelming numerical superiority, was no longer the guarantee of victory it had once seemed to be. The trenches of the First World War had taught the world a terrible and seemingly final lesson: that infantry waves, no matter how determined or numerous, would break against prepared defenses and barbed wire and machine guns. And yet von Ziegt looked at this catastrophe and saw not an ending, but an invitation to think differently. His philosophy, which would gradually permeate the entire structure of the Reichswehr, rested on a single, elegant premise. You need not match your enemy in numbers if you could exceed them in mobility, in training, in the coordination of your forces, and most crucially, in the speed of decision-making. Where traditional military doctrine had emphasized holding territory and attrition, von Ziegt imagined something altogether different. He envisioned an army that would be lean and purposeful, where every soldier was a thinking participant in a broader tactical scheme, rather than a mere component of mass. The Treaty of Versailles had strangled Germany's ability to field vast conscripted armies, but von Ziegt, perhaps with a trace of grim satisfaction, recognized that this very constraint might prove liberating. If Germany could only maintain 100,000 men under the terms of the treaty, then those 100,000 must be exceptional. They must be soldiers who could adapt, who possessed not just technical skill, but intellectual flexibility. He began to reshape the Reichswehr into what might be called an army of officers, a force where leadership permeated every level, where a rifleman understood not just his own role, but how his role connected to the movements of cavalry units, of artillery batteries, of reserves held in readiness some kilometers back. This was profoundly different from the mass conscript armies of France or the Soviet Union, which trained vast numbers of replaceable soldiers to perform narrow, repetitive tasks. Von Ziegt's vision was almost aristocratic in its architecture, though democratic in its implementation. A soldier of the Reichswehr, he believed, should possess what we might call operative independence. He should understand the commander's intent clearly enough that even if communication broke down, even if orders became impossible to relay through the chaos of battle, he could make tactical decisions that aligned with the broader strategic purpose. This concept would later find echoes in German military language as Auftragstaktik, or mission-type orders, the idea that you give your subordinates the objective and the general parameters, and they determine the method of achieving it. Consider for a moment the practical implications of such a philosophy. In the First World War, armies had relied on dense networks of telephone wires and runners to pass orders through the chain of command, an arrangement hideously vulnerable to artillery and disruption. An army trained in this new way, by contrast, could fragment into smaller mobile groups, each understanding the larger operational picture, each capable of responding to opportunities as they emerged. This required not just better training, but a fundamentally different relationship between officers and enlisted men, a system where knowledge and understanding flowed more freely throughout the ranks than contemporary military hierarchies typically allowed. Von Ziegt also grasped something about the relationship between terrain and tactical doctrine that seems obvious only in retrospect. He studied the campaigns of the Eastern Front during the First World War, where despite the horror and the trenches, there had been moments of genuine maneuver, of armies moving hundreds of kilometers, of cavalry still playing a role in warfare. The vast spaces of the Eastern theatre had demanded something different from the grinding positional warfare of France and Flanders. And though the Eastern Front had ultimately descended into the same morass of attrition, von Seeckt believed that the lessons of those more fluid moments held the key to breaking the stalemate forever. The idea took shape gradually, almost like a photograph developing in chemical solution. An army, he reasoned, should be organized around the possibility of rapid movement and sudden concentration of force at a decisive point. Rather than a continuous line spread thin across a front, you would have mobile elements capable of striking at weak points in an enemy's formation, supported by reserves positioned to exploit breakthroughs. The entire structure should operate as an organism capable of rapid healing and reformation, rather than as a rigid wall that breaks catastrophically when penetrated. What made von Seeckt's philosophy so revolutionary was not any single innovation, but rather the integration of these ideas into a coherent system. He did not simply advocate for more cavalry or for experimental new weapons, though he was interested in both. Instead, he was thinking about how an army should move, how information should flow through it, how decisions should be made, and how the various arms, infantry, artillery, cavalry, eventually armor, should coordinate their efforts. The elegance of his approach lay in its recognition that modern war was not about holding space, but about moving through space more quickly and decisively than your opponent, about identifying the enemy's vulnerabilities and striking them with concentrated force before those vulnerabilities could be addressed. There was also, one might observe, something almost contemplative about von Seeckt's approach to military science. Unlike the bluff, industrialized mass warfare that had characterized the First World War, his doctrine suggested that warfare could be conducted with greater sophistication, that victory might come through outmaneuvering rather than outlasting an enemy. For a defeated nation stripped of military might by international treaty, this was a philosophy with particular psychological appeal. The idea that Germany need not resign itself to inferiority, that it might instead transcend the brute force logic that had failed in 1914 to 1918 by developing something superior in kind, if not in scale. The first practical expression of these ideas found form in the organization and training of Reichswehr units throughout the 1920s. Officers began to drill their men not in static positional defense, but in rapid maneuver, in coordination across dispersed formations, in the kind of flexible tactics that von Seeckt had studied and refined. Doctrine began to emphasize smaller, mobile combat teams capable of acting with relative independence. Artillery training shifted towards supporting mobile operations rather than siege-like bombardment. Even the cavalry, which most armies were beginning to view as obsolete, was reimagined by von Seeckt as a fast-moving reconnaissance and exploitation force, a model that would eventually be transferred to mechanized units. This philosophical foundation, this quiet certainty that mobile, coordinated, thinking troops could achieve more than massive numbers of replaceable soldiers, would prove to be the intellectual bedrock upon which everything that followed would rest. The officers who gathered in those quiet rooms of the Truppenamt understood something that the battlefields of the Western Front had etched into the very bones of Europe. The trenches, those long scars running from the English Channel to Switzerland, had become a kind of terrible temple to immobility. Millions had died moving measured yards, and yet, even as the mud of Flanders settled into history, a different kind of warfare was unfolding far to the east, where the vast distances of Russia and the fluid desperation of the Eastern campaigns had painted an entirely different picture of what modern combat might become. It is worth pausing here to consider what the observers and theorists noticed. In the West, the machine gun and barbed wire had created a geometric problem. Defenses grew deeper and wider. Offensives grew bloodier. Attack and counterattack consumed men like a furnace consumes coal, with territorial gains measured in the grim arithmetic of corpses. The generals had thrown cavalry at machine guns. They had sent men in waves across no man's land. They had built supply lines and waited for exhaustion to break the other side. And for 4 years, the line barely moved. This was war as a kind of calculus of attrition, where victory belonged to whoever could afford the greatest losses. But in the east, distance intervened. The Eastern Front stretched for over 1,000 kilometers, and its geography refused compression. You could not wall it off with trenches. The open steppe offered room to maneuver, and so a curious inversion had occurred. Cavalry still moved there. Motorized columns could be deployed across wider spaces. When the Russians conducted their offensives, they pushed forward in surges rather than grinding forward in linear increments. When the Germans withdrew, they had room to turn, to regroup, to counterattack. The pace was different. The rhythm was faster. The outcomes were less predictable. The younger officers who studied these campaigns after the war found themselves drawn to the Eastern experience, almost like a magnet. Here was proof, they believed, that mobility could matter. That speed could compensate for numbers, that if you could attack faster than your enemy could organize defenses, you might break through before he could settle in. The Eastern Front had shown them something the Western trenches had tried hard to hide. That movement was still possible. That the machine age did not necessarily mean stalemate. One thinks, in particular, of the campaigns of 1917 and 1918 in the East. When Russia withdrew from the war and collapsed into revolution, the German army had surged forward with extraordinary mobility. They moved eastward rapidly, occupying vast territories, advancing hundreds of kilometers in weeks. For a brief moment, the war of movement had returned. Cavalry and motorized units had ridden across the steppe. Artillery had been deployed fluidly. It seemed, to observers at the time, a glimpse of an older kind of warfare, one that the Western Front had thought the machine gun had forever killed. And yet this Eastern experience, tantalizing as it was, contained a crucial puzzle. The mobility had worked, yes, but why? Was it because the Russians were less capable, because their defenses were thinner, because their communications were slower, or was it something deeper, something about how rapidly moving forces could actually operate when they weren't forced into the gridlock of continuous linear defenses? The answer, German theorists began to suspect, was both practical and philosophical. Mobile warfare worked when you had space to move in, but it also worked because it offered something psychologically and operationally different. It allowed you to strike where the enemy wasn't yet ready. It allowed you to maintain the initiative. It allowed you to set the terms of the engagement rather than react to the terms set by your opponent. In the aftermath of the war, German military journals began to revisit these Eastern campaigns with new attention. Articles appeared. Discussions happened. Officers who had fought in the swift advances of 1917 and 1918 began to articulate what they had learned. Here in these publications, half hidden from the scrutinizing eyes of the Versailles restrictions, a conversation about mobility slowly took shape. It was quiet. It was theoretical, but it was persistent. The contrast with the Western Front grew sharper in these discussions. The West had taught a lesson of static defense, of entrenchment, of preparation. The East had taught a lesson of fluid offense, of rapid concentration, of surprise. Which teacher was right? Both, perhaps. But the question they posed was this: if the East had shown that mobility was possible, and if the industrial age had not made it irrelevant, then what would a military look like that was designed specifically around mobile warfare rather than around siege warfare? What if you built your entire force around the assumption that you would never be trapped in a trench, but would always be moving forward, finding weak points, sliding through gaps, reforming and striking again? This was not yet the full doctrine of blitzkrieg. That would require faster vehicles, radio communications, aircraft working in direct support of ground units, technologies and coordinations that would take years more to develop. But the seed was there, planted in those quiet study groups and military journals of the 1920s. The seed was the observation that the Eastern Front had suggested something the Western Front had tried to deny, that war could still be a war of movement. If you built your forces and your thinking around the principle of mobility, rather than around the principle of holding ground. The irony, which soldiers would understand clearly, was that the lesson had been learned by the defeated power. Germany, unable to match the resources of the Entente, unable to win the war of attrition in the West, had nonetheless glimpsed in the chaos of the Eastern campaigns a vision of a different kind of warfare altogether. It was a vision that would take nearly 2 decades to fully develop, but in those quiet rooms where military minds were rebuilding German doctrine from the ashes of defeat, the Eastern Front served as a kind of holy text. Here, they believed, lay the future. The German officers who gathered in those small rooms and lecture halls had inherited something far older than the industrial massacres of the Western Front. They had inherited a word, Schwerpunkt, that would become the skeleton key to their entire vision of how modern war might be fought differently. The word itself is German, untranslatable with perfect precision into English, though center of gravity comes close, or sometimes point of main effort, or that old military phrase, the decisive point. But those translations flatten something essential that lives in the original word, a kind of weight and intention rolled into one. Imagine, if you will, a general standing before a map of his enemy's territory, and instead of his mind immediately dividing his forces into neat, equal segments to attack along an extended line, he instead asks himself a quieter, more searching question. Where is the one place, the single fulcrum, where if I concentrate everything I have, not scattered, but gathered, I might break their will to resist? This is Schwerpunkt. Not a position necessarily, though it could be. Not always a place on a map. Sometimes it was a moment. Sometimes it was a particular formation of enemy troops. Sometimes it was the command structure itself. It was the idea that you do not need to be strong everywhere to achieve overwhelming victory. You need to be overwhelmingly strong in one place that matters most. The tragedy of the First World War, from the German perspective, had been the slow grinding away of this principle entirely. Trench warfare demanded that you hold a line, a physical, continuous, unbroken line that stretched for hundreds of miles. You couldn't have a weak point. Every yard had to be defended. Every soldier had to stand shoulder to shoulder with the soldier next to him. The result was that strength was diluted, spread thin like butter across toast that was far too large. Millions of men were consumed simply holding ground, not for any strategic gain, but because the nature of the defensive fortification demanded it. Schwerpunkt thinking didn't survive in that world. But the German officer corps, even defeated, had not forgotten it. There were lessons in the war itself, if you looked in the right places. The great offensives of 1918, Operation Michael, Operation Georgette, had not relied on evenly distributed attacks. The Stoßtruppen, those specialized assault troops, had concentrated their force at predetermined weak points in the enemy line, punched through with overwhelming local superiority, and then spread the breakthrough laterally rather than pushing straight ahead. For a brief moment, before exhaustion and lack of reserves stopped them, this tactics had worked. It had terrified the British and French. What if, the thinking went, what if you could sustain that principle? What if you could make that intensity of focus the entire basis of your army's design? The concept of Schwerpunkt, then, was really a return to something older than the trenches. It was a reassertion that in warfare, as in so many human endeavors, concentration of force at the decisive moment could overcome numerical disadvantage. You did not need more soldiers than your enemy. You needed your soldiers to arrive at the critical point in sufficient strength before the enemy could bring his numbers to bear. It was a thinking rooted in audacity, but also in calculation. It was not recklessness, it was precision, dressed in the language of military theory. The genius of the doctrine, as the Truppenamt began to elaborate it in those hidden years of the 1920s, was that Schwerpunkt didn't dictate where that decisive point had to be. It was a principle of decision-making, not a rigid prescription. It asked each commander to think like a strategist, to study his opponent, to identify not where the enemy was strongest, but where the enemy's entire system of defense might be most vulnerable to a concentrated blow. Where was the nerve center? Where was the assumption the enemy had made about where you could not possibly strike? Where could you achieve the maximum effect with the minimum expenditure of your limited resources? This was particularly important for Germany in those constrained years after Versailles. The Reichswehr would never be able to match France's manpower or equipment, at least not for some years. Britain controlled the seas. The Poles, the Czechs, even Austria, and other smaller neighbors had their own defensive arrangements. So how do you defeat an enemy you cannot simply overwhelm? You don't attack where they are ready. You attack where they are not. You concentrate where they are dispersed. You move faster than they can respond. You identify the one point on the entire battlefield where victory can be achieved, and you put everything you have into that point, and nowhere else. This required a different kind of army than what European powers had generally built. It required not conscripted masses, but highly trained, intelligent soldiers who could adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. It required officers who understood the principles so deeply that they could make decisions independently without waiting for orders from a distant command center. It required mobility, fast-moving units that could bypass resistance rather than grind through it. And gradually, as the 1920s wore on and the Truppenamt refined these ideas, it began to seem less like an abstract principle and more like a practical foundation for a complete reimagining of what an army could be. The term itself, Schwerpunkt, appears in military writings going back centuries in German military tradition, but it was the officers of this post-war period who would breathe new life into it, who would make it the central animating principle of a new kind of warfare. They understood something that many of their counterparts in other armies had not quite grasped, that the industrial age had created the possibility of a new kind of speed, and that speed, properly concentrated, could be a force multiplier as powerful as numbers. If you could move your concentrated force faster than the enemy could assemble his dispersed forces to meet you, the mathematics of the battlefield changed entirely. And so the concept settled into the German military consciousness, like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reshape how wars would be conceived and fought. In the quiet libraries and officers' clubs of Weimar Germany, there existed a thinker whose words had been dead for nearly 80 years, yet whose ghost moved through every conversation about how wars might be fought differently. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian general and theorist who had lived through the Napoleonic Wars and the turbulent decades that followed, had written a single massive work called On War, a dense and sometimes contradictory meditation on the nature of conflict that had sat, largely unread by the outside world, as a kind of intellectual treasure locked away in German military culture. The very officers who were now secretly rebuilding German doctrine in the 1920s and 1930s didn't need to rediscover Clausewitz. He had never left their world. He was woven into the fabric of Prussian and German military education, a presence so fundamental that young officers absorbed his ideas the way one absorbs the air of one's homeland. What drew these thinkers back to Clausewitz with such intensity during this period was one particular concept that seemed to speak directly to their predicament. Clausewitz had written about what he called the Schwerpunkt, and here the linguistic echo is no accident, though the word itself had existed long before him, the center of gravity, the focal point where the greatest concentration of force and will must be directed if one hoped to overcome an enemy's resistance. It was not a new idea, but Clausewitz had articulated it with a clarity and philosophical depth that gave it weight and permanence. He had argued that in any conflict, there are certain points that matter more than others, certain places where the outcome will truly be decided, and that a commander's genius lay not in spreading force evenly across a defensive line, as the Great War had seemed to demand, but rather in identifying where that critical point lay, and then gathering overwhelming strength there. The appeal of this concept to German officers, tasked with reimagining their military after defeat, was almost obvious, yet also deeply profound. The First World War had taught them, through horrible and repeated experience, that spreading your forces thin across miles and miles of trench achieved nothing but stalemate and the grinding away of manpower. The Western Front had become a monument to the failure of even distribution, to the idea that if you simply occupied enough ground with enough soldiers, you would win. Instead, millions had died for mere hundreds of yards. But Clausewitz offered an intellectual path out of that thinking. He suggested that the answer was not more bodies, not more guns spread across a wider frontage, but rather a clear mind identifying the single point where battle would be decided, and then the will to concentrate everything there. Hans von Seeckt and the officers of the Truppenamt found in Clausewitz's writings a permission and a framework. They could point to his authority when they proposed that a small German army, even a much smaller one than what the Treaty of Versailles had taken from them, could still be devastating if it understood its Schwerpunkt, if it could see the seams in an opponent's defences and drive through with calculated ferocity at exactly the right moment. Clausewitz became, in a sense, the intellectual guardian of their ambitions, the dead general who seemed to have foreseen their situation and offered them a solution. What made this even more subtle and seductive was that Clausewitz himself had been wrestling with questions of mobility and maneuver. Though his own experience had been shaped by the Napoleonic Wars, with their cavalry sweeps and rapid movements across European terrain, he had also reflected deeply on the relationship between concentration of force and the psychological moment, what he called the culminating point, the instant when an offensive effort reaches its maximum effect before exhaustion sets in. A commander who could identify this moment and concentrate his strength at the right place and the right time would have an advantage that mere numbers could never guarantee. This was a doctrine for the intelligent, the mobile, the swift, the perceptive. It was a doctrine that seemed to reward the qualities that small, elite armies could possess. The German military theorists of the interwar period didn't simply read Clausewitz as history, they read him as a kind of instruction manual, though one they had to interpret and adapt to their own circumstances. The concepts were there: focal points, concentration of effort, the identification of the decisive moment, but the mechanisms of how these would actually be achieved in the 20th century, with new technologies and new possibilities for coordination, that was the puzzle they were beginning to solve in secret. Clausewitz had given them the philosophy. Now they had to construct the machinery to make that philosophy real. There was also something almost reassuring about this intellectual lineage. It connected the new German military ideas back to Prussia's greatest military theorist, to a thinker who had been admired across Europe, even by their enemies. It provided legitimacy. This was not, in other words, some radical departure from German tradition, but rather a return to it, a recovery of principles that had always been central to German military thought, merely obscured by the muddy chaos of the First World War. Clausewitz's shadow stretched across the 1920s and 1930s like a long afternoon light, illuminating a path that the officers rebuilding German doctrine believed they were meant to follow. And yet there was an irony in this embrace of Clausewitz's ideas that the officers of this period, for all their intelligence and their strategic acumen, may not have fully appreciated. Clausewitz himself had written with a kind of tragic awareness about the impossibility of perfect prediction, about the role of chance and friction in warfare, about the way even the best laid plans encounter reality and break apart. The doctrine that would grow out of this period, this Schwerpunkt strategy that would become Blitzkrieg, would be presented to the world, and indeed would come to believe in itself, as a kind of perfected system, a way of war that had transcended the old limitations. But it was built upon an intellectual foundation that acknowledged, at its deepest level, that no plan survives contact with the enemy unchanged. That contradiction would matter, though not immediately, and not in the way anyone might have predicted. In the dying months of the First World War, on the muddy approaches to the Hindenburg Line, a different kind of soldier was beginning to move across the landscape. These were the Stoßtruppen, the stormtroopers, and they carried with them a tactical innovation born not from grand theory, but from the grinding necessity of breaking an enemy who would not break. The trench had become a tomb for the old methods of frontal assault, and so the Germans, with characteristic methodical intensity, had begun to experiment with something more subtle. Instead of sending waves of men across no man's land, in the hope that sheer numbers and artillery preparation would overwhelm the enemy, they sent small, self-contained groups of highly trained infantry moving rapidly through the weaknesses in the opposing line. These infiltration tactics, as they came to be known, were a whisper where previous assaults had been a scream. The idea was deceptively simple, though executing it required a discipline and flexibility that many armies of that era found almost impossible to sustain. Rather than waiting for a perfect artillery barrage to reduce every enemy strongpoint to dust, a process that could take weeks and announce the coming assault to everyone watching, the stormtroopers would move forward in small columns, bypassing strongpoints entirely, moving through gaps, using terrain and darkness to their advantage, and leaving isolated pockets of enemy resistance to be mopped up by following waves of more conventional infantry. The goal was not to kill every enemy soldier, but to move so quickly and unpredictably that the enemy's defensive lines became confused, fractured, leaderless. Momentum itself became a weapon. What made this approach remarkable, and what the post-war German military would later seize upon with almost religious fervor, was that it represented a fundamentally different way of thinking about warfare. It suggested that intelligence and speed and coordination among small units could sometimes accomplish what overwhelming firepower could not. It suggested that an army did not need to match the enemy's strength everywhere to defeat him. It only needed to be stronger at the decisive point. And crucially, it depended not on rigid hierarchical obedience, but on junior officers and non-commissioned officers who understood the broader intent of the operation and could make independent decisions as circumstances demanded. When the war ended and Germany's armies, defeated but not entirely destroyed, marched home through streets that would soon become avenues of resentment and political upheaval, many of the officers who had survived the trenches carried these tactical lessons with them like seeds. How might one take these infiltration methods, which had shown such promise in the final offensives of 1918, and develop them further? How might one build, from these scattered experiments in the mud, an entire philosophy of warfare? In the quiet years that followed, as the Truppenamt set about its clandestine work of reinventing German military doctrine, the stormtroopers' methods became the subject of intense study and reinterpretation. Military journals, published under careful oversight and distributed among the officer corps, began to dissect what had worked and what had failed in those desperate final months of the war. And here is where something fascinating occurred, a kind of intellectual alchemy that transformed a desperate tactical expedient born from material scarcity into the theoretical foundation of an entirely new approach to warfare. The journals spoke of these infiltration tactics not as isolated tricks, but as expressions of a deeper principle. They existed, military theorists began to argue, because the Germans understood something that their enemies did not, that modern warfare need not be a test of attrition, a grinding contest of who could suffer longer. It could instead be a test of will and intelligence, of the ability to strike at the enemy's coherence rather than his substance. A small, mobile, thinking army might accomplish what a larger, slower, more mechanically obedient force could not. One might ask whether these post-war thinkers fully understood what they were doing, whether they recognized that they were taking the desperate improvisations of 1918 and elevating them into a vision of the future. Likely, they understood it only partially. They knew that something had worked. They grasped, with varying degrees of clarity, why it had worked. What they were constructing, almost without fully realizing it, was a narrative framework that would permit German officers to imagine a different kind of army and a different kind of war. The infiltration tactics also provided something else of profound importance. They offered a model of how small units could operate with a degree of autonomy within a larger strategic framework. The stormtrooper company did not need to await permission from distant commanders to change direction when it encountered a gap in the enemy line. It moved according to what was sometimes called the principle of mission command. The commander established the objective and the means available. and subordinate leaders determined how best to achieve it. This was subtly but profoundly different from the mechanical hierarchical obedience that had characterized so much of the warfare of previous eras. It required trust, training, and a common understanding of purpose. These post-war military journals, dense with technical discussion and careful historical analysis, were in many ways the birthplace of the doctrine that would later take the name Blitzkrieg. They represented a kind of archaeological work on the recent past, miners descending into the coalface of 1918 to extract valuable ore. They asked not simply what had the stormtroopers done, but why had it worked, and what could one build from that knowledge? The answers they developed would echo forward through the 1920s and 1930s, shaping the way a new generation of German officers imagined warfare. The transition was not instantaneous, nor was it inevitable, but over years of study and reflection and careful doctrine writing, the infiltration tactics of the First World War gradually transformed into something more ambitious and more systematic. They became, in essence, the tactical seed from which the concept of combined arms operations would grow, the idea that infantry, armor, and air power, coordinated with precision, could move together in ways that mimicked those small, fluid, penetrating groups of stormtroopers, but on a vastly larger scale and with exponentially greater destructive capacity. What had begun as a solution to the problem of breaking through a heavily fortified defensive line in 1918 would gradually evolve into something far more comprehensive, a vision of how modern warfare itself might be conducted. And the transformation occurred almost entirely within the realm of theory and study, in the quiet conversations of officers and in the patient, methodical pages of military journals, far from the eyes of those who had written the Treaty of Versailles and believed themselves to have locked Germany into permanent military inferiority. Yet here lay a profound paradox at the very heart of Germany's military rebirth. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden tanks entirely. No tanks, no armored vehicles of war, no tracked mechanical beasts that could pierce a line and reshape a battlefield. And so the officers of the Reichswehr, these careful thinkers who gathered in their modest offices in Berlin and studied the lessons of the Great War with such disciplined precision, found themselves in an impossible position. How do you build a doctrine of mobile warfare when the very machines that make it possible are forbidden to you? The answer, when it came, was both ingenious and deeply practical. It was also, in its way, rather beautifully German, this capacity to work around constraint through intellectual clarity and patient experiment. What if you could study tank theory without tanks? What if you could train your officers and your soldiers in the coordination and timing and psychology of armored assault through imagination, through careful substitution, through methods that were just technical enough to preserve the knowledge, but invisible enough to escape international scrutiny? In the training grounds of the Reichswehr through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, a quiet work began. Wooden frames, no larger or more threatening than farm equipment, were constructed to represent tanks. Imagine these structures, if you will, rough rectangular shapes mounted on wheels or simple platforms, painted in soft greys and tans, moving across the landscape at walking speed, or perhaps slightly faster. To an outsider, to the inspectors and observers who might pass by, they were merely training aids, nothing more alarming than the wooden horses of cavalry drill grounds. But to the officers and soldiers who maneuvered around them, these dummy tanks carried enormous significance. They were vessels for understanding. They were the ghosts of a future that was being quietly rehearsed in the present. Think about what this meant in practical terms. An officer could study how infantry should move in coordination with an armored point. He could learn the timing, the spacing, the moment when you push hard and when you consolidate. He could understand, in his bones and in his mind simultaneously, how a breakthrough happens, how the moment of rupture unfolds. The dummy tank taught doctrine, it taught rhythm, it taught the vocabulary of maneuver warfare even when the actual machines were forbidden. But there was another approach, one equally ingenious and perhaps even more imaginative. The Germans, denied tanks by treaty, turned their attention to gliders. Now, gliders were not technically armored vehicles. They were unpowered aircraft, silent craft that could be towed into the sky and then released to descend on their targets. The military utility of gliders was considerable for other purposes, certainly for landing troops, for rapid deployment. But here is where the ingenuity deepens. By studying gliders and airborne assault tactics, German theorists were actually working their way toward understanding rapid, concentrated descent upon a point of enemy weakness. A glider swarm dropping soldiers behind a line was, in a sense, an exercise in the same principle as a tank spearhead breaking through: concentration, velocity, coordination, the overwhelming of a point through rapid assembly of force. The glider program itself, which became increasingly sophisticated through the 1930s, operated in a kind of intellectual double life. On one level, it was a genuinely valuable innovation in airborne assault, leading eventually to real historical applications. But on another level, it was also a way of keeping alive and developing the fundamental concepts of mobile breakthrough doctrine, concepts that would later transfer almost directly to armored operations when tanks finally became available. During these years of constraint, military journals and training manuals circulated quietly among the officer corps. These were not thick theoretical treatises designed for public consumption, but rather working documents, memos, field studies that captured the thinking of men like von Seeckt and his successors as they wrestled with the problem of modern warfare under impossible restrictions. What emerges from these texts, when you read them now with careful attention, is a doctrine being thought through from first principles. These officers were not simply dreaming, they were calculating, they were studying, they were preparing the intellectual ground so that when, and they clearly believed, when would come, when the tanks finally arrived, the German army would be ready. The preparation would not be mechanical or rushed. It would be comprehensive. The genius of this approach lay in its separation of the essential from the incidental. What was essential about tank warfare? It was not the tank itself, though of course the machine mattered enormously. It was the principle behind it. It was the understanding that concentrated mobile force could break a line that appeared solid. It was the knowledge that once you penetrated, you kept moving. That you did not stop to consolidate. That the breakthrough itself became the new front line, the new position from which to develop momentum. This principle could be taught with dummy vehicles and maps, and careful argument, even if the actual machines were not yet available. And so through the late 1920s and the early 1930s, even as the international community watched Germany with suspicion, even as the League of Nations attempted to enforce the military restrictions of Versailles, within German barracks and training grounds and military academies, a generation of officers was learning to think in terms of armor, in terms of coordinated breakthrough, in terms of rapid maneuver and concentrated force. The tanks themselves would come later, but the doctrine, the mental framework, the operational language, these were being forged in a land where actual tanks were forbidden. What a strange echo this creates when you consider it in the larger arc of how military thought evolves. Often we think of innovation as springing from resources, from abundance, from the ability to build and test and refine through brute force of experiment. But sometimes, constraint breeds creativity. Necessity invents its own disciplines. The forbidden tank became, in a sense, the most carefully studied tank in the world, because it had to be imagined before it could be built. Yet here lay a peculiar paradox, one that few observers in the 1920s and early 1930s could have imagined. Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies separated by an unbridgeable gulf of philosophy and political order, were quietly, methodically building something together in the heart of Russian territory. It began almost by accident, born from necessity and mutual advantage, in the industrial sprawl of a place called Kazan, nearly 1,000 kilometers east of Moscow, where the Volga winds through the continental interior. The Germans had a problem that Versailles had made abundantly clear. They could not openly manufacture tanks. The treaty forbade it, with inspectors prowling and nations watching. But they needed to learn. They needed to understand what armor could do, how it moved across terrain, how men in cramped metal shells could fight as a coordinated force. The Soviets, for their part, had tanks in growing numbers, but lacked the precision engineering, the refined mechanical doctrine that German craftsmanship promised. They wanted knowledge as much as the Germans wanted laboratory space. So in 1926, quietly enough that the broader world barely noticed, the two nations opened a school. Not quite a school, really, more a shadow space, a place where the forbidden could be studied behind walls and distance. The Kama Tank School, as it came to be known in German records, became one of the most important proving grounds for armored warfare that existed in the world at that time. And almost no one outside the military circles of both nations knew it existed. Picture it, a remote installation in the vast Russian countryside, tanks rumbling across steppes instead of German fields, German officers learning the weight and feel of armor, testing theories that had lived only in notebooks and strategic discussions. The sun would rise over those open spaces, and men in grey would stand watching as mechanical beasts turned and fired and pressed forward through exercises that no Western observer was permitted to witness. The collaboration began through the Reichswehr's liaison with Russia. There were other secret arrangements between Germany and the Soviet Union in these years: military missions, intelligence sharing driven by the strange logic that two enemies of the broader European order might have reasons to work together. But the tank trials at Kazan were something more intimate. They were a marriage of need and engineering, of doctrine waiting to be born. The Germans sent carefully selected officers and engineers. These were men chosen not just for technical competence, but for their discretion, their ability to observe, to learn, to absorb what armor could teach, without speaking of it when they returned. They watched as Soviet tanks operated in conditions radically different from anything on German soil: the wide-open terrain, the dust, the distances that European battlefields did not offer. They saw how weight distributed across a hull, how treads gripped frozen or muddy earth, how gun mechanisms performed under the stress of real movement and sustained practice. What did they learn? In those years, in that remote place, they learned something fundamental about the nature of mobile warfare. They discovered that tanks were not simply armored platforms for infantry support, as many military minds still conceived them. They learned, through hard observation and repeated trials, that tanks could be the spearhead. They could move quickly enough, if organized properly. They could concentrate force at a chosen point with devastating effect. The very landscape of Kazan, with its sweeping spaces and sightlines, taught lessons that the fragmented terrain of Central Europe could not. The Soviets, watching German officers methodically dissecting problems of armor and maneuver, were themselves absorbing lessons in precision and organization. It was a two-way current of knowledge, though each nation guarded what it learned for its own purposes. The Germans were building theory, the Soviets were expanding production. Neither could have said with certainty how those two streams of knowledge would diverge and eventually flow into opposition. The trials at Kazan continued intermittently through the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, even as political relations between Germany and the Soviet Union grew distant and then hostile. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, the experiments were beginning to wind down, the foreign military missions were being withdrawn. Ideological pressure made the collaboration increasingly untenable, yet what had been learned in that remote corner of Russia would echo through the next decade of German military development. One wonders, perhaps, what those German officers were thinking as they watched tanks move across the Kazan steppes. Did they grasp the historical significance of those moments? Did they sense they were witnessing a transformation in the nature of warfare itself? The records suggest a more practical focus: measurements, observations, notes in careful handwriting about performance and failure. Yet in those trials, in that hidden place far from the eyes of treaty inspectors and suspicious neighbors, something was taking shape. The theory that had lived in books and in minds was beginning to become reality, brick by brick and trial by trial. And then, As suddenly as it had opened, the window closed. By the mid-1930s, the German officers stopped going to Kazan. The Kama Tank School was no longer a place for secret collaboration. The world was moving toward the moment when these two nations would face each other across battlefields, when all that had been learned together would be turned to opposite purposes. But the knowledge remained, carried in the notebooks and memories of men like Guderian and the engineers who had stood in the Russian countryside and watched armor teach them how the future would look. What remained was not just technical understanding, but something deeper, a vision of how warfare itself might be reorganized around speed and concentrated force. Kazan had been a shadow workshop where doctrine was hammered into shape, where theoretical and practical understanding came together in the solitude of foreign ground. The trials there had no official existence in the diplomatic world. To Western observers, they might as well never have happened. Yet for the men who were there, in that remote installation where two ideological enemies worked briefly in concert, something had shifted. The seeds of blitzkrieg were being watered in a place the world was not meant to see. And yet the doctrine might never have crystallized into something truly revolutionary had it not been for a rather unlikely intellectual exchange, one that unfolded across the Channel in the late 1920s and early 1930s. While von Seeckt built his small army on the principle of elite mobility and concentrated effort, there existed in Britain two thinkers whose writings would prove to be the missing lens through which Germany could suddenly see its own instincts made systematic. Their names were J.F.C. Fuller and B.H. Liddell Hart, and though they wrote in English and served the British Crown, their ideas found their most attentive reader in a Prussian cavalry officer named Heinz Guderian. Guderian was not an easy man to dismiss. Born in the final years of the 19th century, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had been educated in both the old military traditions and the new technological age. Unlike some of his contemporaries who clung to horse and saber nostalgia, Guderian possessed a peculiar hunger, a hunger to understand not just what machines could do, but how they might think differently about warfare altogether. He spoke languages, he read voraciously, and most crucially, he was willing to look beyond the borders of his own nation's military journals to find enlightenment. Fuller's writings came to Guderian as something of a revelation. Here was a British officer, trained in the conventional traditions of the British Army, yet arguing with almost prophetic clarity that the future of warfare lay not in trench lines stretched across the land like sinews, but in deep penetration, in speed, in the coordinated movement of armored vehicles accompanied by motorized infantry and air support. Fuller had watched the trenches of the First World War with the same disgust that every thinking soldier felt, and he had asked himself a deceptively simple question: what if we stopped thinking about territory and started thinking about movement? What if the goal was not to hold ground, but to dislocate the enemy's entire system before they could react? This was not new in the abstract sense. Sun Tzu had written of it, Napoleon had practiced it, but Fuller was arguing it in the language of the 20th century, with tanks and internal combustion engines as his metaphors. And Guderian read him, absorbed him, began to recognize that the cavalry officer's instincts for speed and exploitation, the very thing he had been trained in since boyhood, could be married to the power of the machine. But Fuller alone might have remained an interesting curiosity. It was Liddell Hart who provided something closer to a comprehensive philosophy, and in many ways, he was the more influential mind for Guderian's own crystallization of doctrine. Liddell Hart had developed what he called the indirect approach, a concept rooted in the observation that direct assault against a well-prepared enemy is invariably costly and often futile. Instead, he argued, one must aim at the enemy's decision-making center, at the psychological and logistical coherence that holds their forces together. You do not fight the enemy's army head-on. You fight to unmake their army's ability to coordinate, to resupply, to be commanded. You strike at their thinking, not merely at their flesh. This notion of the indirect approach resonated with something deep in German military tradition, though perhaps neither Liddell Hart nor Guderian recognized it fully at the time. It echoed Clausewitz's emphasis on the center of gravity, on finding not the enemy's strongest point, but their most crucial point. But where Clausewitz had written in the shadows of Napoleonic cavalry charges and 18th century maneuvering, Liddell Hart was writing in the industrial age, asking how these ancient principles of maneuver might be reborn through mechanics. Guderian's genius, and it is perhaps worth pausing here to acknowledge what genius truly means in this context, lay in his ability to read these British theorists not as abstract philosophers, but as blueprints. He did not simply accept their arguments and file them away in his memory. Instead, he began to ask himself how these principles might be married to the specific constraints and resources available to Germany. He studied the technical specifications of tank development. He considered the question of radio communication, which neither Fuller nor Liddell Hart had emphasized to the same degree. He thought about how artillery might be coordinated with armor. He contemplated the role of air power not as a separate domain, but as an integrated arm of the same concentrated strike. What emerged from this long intellectual digestion was something that was neither purely German nor purely British, but a synthesis that took the conceptual rigor of Liddell Hart and Fuller and adapted it to German military organization and thinking. Guderian wrote his own books and articles, and in them he began to articulate what a full execution of these principles might look like. But his words were not abstract. They were suffused with the practical details of how a panzer division might actually move across terrain, how a motorcycle reconnaissance platoon might locate a weak point in enemy lines, how concentrated fire from dozens of tanks could be directed, not haphazardly, but with the coordination of a single organism. One might wonder whether these British thinkers were delighted or dismayed to learn, years later, how thoroughly their ideas had been absorbed by German military intellectuals. The historical record offers us little in the way of recorded sentiment, though Liddell Hart lived long enough after the war to reflect on the peculiar irony of having influenced the enemy he had sought to warn his own nation against. There is something unsettling in the thought that prophetic wisdom, when ignored by those to whom it is first offered, can find reception in unexpected places. What matters here, as we drift deeper into the story of how Blitzkrieg came to be, is that Guderian became not merely a theorist, but an advocate, a crusader almost, for the wholesale adoption of these ideas within the German military structure. He did not work in isolation. He had allies, men who shared his conviction that the old way of thinking about tanks, as slow, heavily armored vehicles that would advance at the pace of infantry, was fundamentally mistaken. But Guderian possessed something that many of his colleagues lacked: the ability to write clearly, to argue persuasively, and to demonstrate through careful reasoning why these ideas were not fanciful but practical, achievable, even inevitable. As the 1930s progressed, as Germany's rearmament began to accelerate and resources became available for the systematic development of panzer forces, Guderian found himself increasingly in positions of influence. He was promoted, given command of panzer units, tasked with developing training doctrine, and in each role he carried with him this intellectual synthesis, German tradition filtered through British vision, creating something that was genuinely novel. Yet, there remained a profound problem that no amount of theoretical refinement could solve: a gap between the elegance of doctrine on paper and the brutal reality of coordinating movement across dozens of kilometers of contested ground. How could a commander, sitting in a headquarters tent 10 kilometers behind the front, possibly direct the actions of dispersed panzer columns, motor-mounted infantry, and support units spread across a landscape fragmented by enemy fire and the fog of war itself? The answer, when it came, arrived not as a dramatic invention, but as a quiet recognition that the machinery of modern warfare required a nervous system as advanced as its muscles. In the early 1920s, radio technology in Europe was still primarily the domain of engineers and experimentalists, a tool of distant communication between capitals and naval vessels, a thing of crackling uncertainty and limited range. Yet German officers, even as they crafted their maneuver doctrine in the drawing rooms and staff colleges of the Weimar Republic, began to perceive something that others had not yet fully grasped. If armies were to move with speed, if concentrated force was to remain coordinated and responsive across wide battlefields, then the command structure itself had to become mobile and instantaneous. Wireless transmission, for all its imperfections, offered the possibility of breaking the traditional chain of hierarchical order that had bound commanders to their telephone lines and to the physical limitations of the telegraph. By the late 1920s, experimental radio sets began appearing in German army exercises, clumsy things by later standards, heavy and temperamental, but functional. Officers learned to speak in codes and brevity, to convey intent and orders through the static and hum of the airwaves, rather than waiting for written messages carried by messenger motorcycle. This represented a subtle but revolutionary shift in the psychology of command. The general could now reach forward into the battle itself, not to micromanage, which would have been impossible anyway, but to shape the flow of operations in real time, to redirect a breakthrough as it developed, to reinforce success rather than wait for reports to arrive and decisions to permeate downward through layers of hierarchy. Consider the profound difference this made to the execution of Schwerpunkt Doctrine. A commander identifying the decisive point, the vulnerable seam in an enemy's defenses, could now communicate that insight directly to the panzer column that was already advancing toward it. Where once such discoveries might have taken hours to translate into actual movement, hours in which the moment of opportunity could dissolve, radio allowed for a kind of distributed intelligence, a conversation between commander and the men at the point of maximum danger, conducted at the speed of voice rather than the speed of a running messenger. The German army did not invent radio technology, of course. The British and French and Soviets all possessed it as well. What distinguished the German approach was the organizational embrace of it, the decision to weave it into the very fabric of how units would communicate with one another and with their higher command. The Panzerwaffe, the emerging mechanized arm that would become the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, was conceived from its inception as a radio-networked force. Tank companies developed radio discipline and protocols. Motor-mounted infantry squadrons trained with radio operators as integral members of their teams. Artillery units learned to receive target corrections through the ether rather than through visual signals or direct telephonic instruction. This represented a form of technological discipline that extended far beyond the mere presence of transmitters and receivers. German officers developed an understanding of what one might call radio-enabled tactics, a way of fighting that assumed constant communication between dispersed elements. A panzer commander could call for air support and describe his situation. A Luftwaffe liaison officer could relay that request to dive bombers waiting at airfields kilometers away. Infantry units encountering unexpected resistance could radio for tank support without waiting for an order to filter down through division headquarters. The distributed nature of radio communication, many voices on the same frequency, hearing the same battlefield updates, created a shared understanding of the battle's flow in a way that written orders and telephone conversations between isolated command posts never could. Yet we should be cautious not to overstate the reliability or simplicity of this system. German radio sets in the 1930s and early 1940s were prone to malfunction, especially in the damp and cold of northern climates. Radio discipline sometimes broke down under stress. Operators made errors. Frequencies were jammed. The British and French, when they finally encountered German formations in battle, noted with some surprise that German radio chatter seemed constant and sometimes frantic, suggesting perhaps a degree of confusion rather than the smooth coordination of later legend. But the crucial point remains. Germany had made a deliberate strategic choice to build its mobile warfare doctrine around the assumption that units could communicate continuously, and to organize its training, its procurement, and its officer development around that assumption. This decision rippled outward through the entire military organization, in ways that were not immediately obvious to outside observers. If you wanted soldiers who could fight effectively in a radio-networked formation, you needed a different kind of soldier than had fought in the trenches. You needed men who could understand spoken orders that came through crackling static, who could respond quickly to changing tactical situations without waiting for written clarification, who could think independently within a framework of overall intent rather than following rigidly detailed instructions. This suggested, in turn, a different approach to recruitment, training, and officer selection. The German army began, in the years after Versailles, to select officers not primarily on the basis of aristocratic background or seniority, but on demonstrated capacity for rapid decision-making and adaptability, the very qualities that a radio-networked, dispersed formation would require. One might wonder whether the radio technology itself drove the doctrine, or whether the doctrine shaped how radio would be employed. In truth, it was a reciprocal relationship, a feedback loop between technological possibility and military innovation. The availability of radio made maneuver warfare more feasible. The commitment to maneuver warfare created demand for improved radio systems. The improving systems enabled more complex and rapid maneuvers. Engineers in German laboratories, driven by the imperatives of the Panzerwaffe's vision, developed increasingly robust radio sets, designed specifically for the demands of mobile warfare, sets that could operate while vehicles were in motion, that consumed fuel and ammunition, along with transmitting power, that had to function in coordination with armor plating and gunfire, and the electromagnetic chaos of a battlefield. The quiet revolution in German military technology in the 1930s was not primarily a revolution in individual weapons or vehicles, though those mattered. It was, in a deeper sense, a revolution in how fighting men would be connected to one another and to their commanders, how information would flow through a military organization, how decisions would be made and communicated at the pace of events rather than at the pace of traditional military bureaucracy. This nervous system, the radio network, the protocols, the training, the cultural shift toward faster and more distributed decision-making became, in many ways, as important to the success of Blitzkrieg as the tanks themselves, perhaps more so. One begins to perceive, as these pieces accumulated through the 1930s, how thoroughly German military thought had been transformed from the defensive, static conceptions that had dominated the First World War. The radio network was not an afterthought or an accessory to armored divisions. It was woven into their very being, into how they thought about fighting and moving and communicating with one another. By the time the 1st Panzer Divisions rolled toward Poland in the autumn of 1939, they were not merely technical innovations in motion, they were expressions of a doctrine that had learned to think in terms of speed, coordination, and the rapid exploitation of advantage. And at the heart of that coordination was the steady hum of radio frequencies carrying voices forward into the battle, a technological embodiment of Schwerpunkt itself, concentrated force, coordinated across distance, adapted in real time to the shifting landscape of combat. Yet all these ideas, the concentration of force, the mobility, the theoretical framework that Guderian had absorbed so carefully from Fuller and Hart, remained fundamentally incomplete without the machinery to bind them together. A doctrine is only as powerful as the coordinated bodies that carry it out. And by the early 1930s, as Germany began to shake off the restrictions of Versailles and to rearm in earnest, the real work began, not in the pages of military journals or in the careful calculations of general staff officers, but in the muddy fields where different branches of the armed forces had to learn, for the first time in any systematic way, to think and move as a single organism. Consider for a moment what had existed before. In the Great War, tanks had rolled forward as isolated instruments of breakthrough, often without adequate infantry support or coordination with artillery. Aircraft flew their own campaigns in the sky, almost entirely divorced from what was happening on the ground below. Cavalry and infantry units operated according to traditions centuries old, moving at the pace of marching men, or, in rare cases, trucks that bumped along rough roads. Artillery batteries received orders that took hours to transmit and execute. The entire machine was compartmentalized, each piece moving according to its own logic, its own doctrine, its own chain of command. The genius of what emerged from German thinking in the 1930s was not that any of these components was new, rather, it was the recognition that they could be woven together into something more fluid, more responsive, more deadly in its coordination. The Panzer Division that took shape during these years was conceived not as a collection of tanks with some infantry attached, but as an integrated system, armor providing the spearhead and the firepower, motorized infantry following close behind to seize and hold what the tanks broke open, artillery moving with them rather than staying behind, ready to suppress resistance or exploit breakthroughs within minutes rather than hours. What made this possible, in large part, was mechanization. As Germany began to produce trucks and half-tracks in greater numbers, infantry no longer had to march. They could move at the same pace as the tanks, covering distances in hours that would once have taken days. They could arrive at a breakthrough point relatively fresh, ready to fight, rather than exhausted from hours of foot marching. This was not revolutionary in concept. The idea of motorized infantry was not German, but the systematic integration of motorized transport into the divisional structure, the way it was threaded through the entire organization, rather than scattered among units, was something different. Artillery underwent perhaps the most profound transformation in thinking. Traditional artillery doctrine held that guns should stay well behind the front lines, protected and relatively static, firing according to carefully calculated fire plans that were coordinated with headquarters far to the rear. German artillery officers began, gradually, to imagine something else. What if artillery could move more quickly? What if it could be positioned not miles behind the front, but within a mile or two, ready to shift its fire rapidly from one target to another as the situation evolved? What if, most radically, infantry and armor commanders on the front line could call for artillery support and receive it within minutes, rather than waiting for a formal request to work its way up through channels? This required new technologies and new attitudes. Radio equipment became essential, not as a luxury or a communications aid, but as the actual nervous system of the entire formation. A panzer officer pushing forward needed to speak directly to his supporting artillery. An infantry commander breaking through needed to contact the next armored reserve waiting several kilometers behind. Air support needed to know, in real time, where ground forces were located so that it could strike at resistance rather than at friendly troops. And this was still astonishingly difficult in the 1930s and even into the early 1940s, yet it was pursued with a kind of determined intensity that made German combined arms, at its best, responsive in ways that other armies struggled to match. The Luftwaffe's role in all this was also being conceived in new ways. In the war that had just ended, aircraft had mostly fought other aircraft. They had done reconnaissance, certainly, and some had attempted ground attack, but there was no real doctrine of air support for ground operations. German airmen and ground officers began to think of dive bombers and single-engine fighters not primarily as weapons for air-to-air combat, though they could do that, but as flying artillery, rapid, responsive, able to move from one sector to another almost instantaneously. A Stuka dive bomber, screaming downward at a steep angle and releasing its bomb load at low altitude, could deliver precision firepower to a specific target with an intensity that ground artillery could only approximate. What if these machines could be directed by officers on the ground? What if they could be called in to support a breakthrough much the way artillery was? Again, this was not entirely new in theory, but the systematic development of procedures, training, and equipment to make it work was something Germany pursued with particular intensity. Forward observation posts had to be equipped with radios. Air liaison officers had to be embedded with ground formations. Pilots had to be trained not just to fly and fight, but to coordinate with ground commanders whom they might never meet. The organizational frameworks had to be built from scratch, and much of this work occurred quietly, almost unseen, in barracks and training grounds across Germany during years when the outside world still believed German rearmament was nothing more than a bluff. One might wonder, as we trace these developments, whether this represented a sudden leap of genius or something more gradual. The answer, it seems, was both. There were certainly moments of intellectual insight, officers and theorists who grasped, more clearly than their contemporaries, how these pieces might fit together. But there was also a great deal of trial and error, of false starts and abandoned ideas, of training exercises that revealed problems that required years to solve. A panzer division that existed on paper in 1935 looked quite different from one that rolled into Poland in 1939, and that one in turn was not quite the same as the formations that attacked France in 1940. The organizational structure itself crystallized gradually. A panzer division was not given its final form all at once, but evolved through a series of experiments and refinements. Early divisions were too heavy in armor, with too little supporting infantry and artillery. Later divisions achieved better balance, though that balance was itself constantly questioned and adjusted. Support units, signals, supply, maintenance, had to grow exponentially to keep these faster-moving formations supplied and functional. The entire logistical apparatus of the German army had to be reimagined to support units that no longer moved at walking pace, but at 10, 15, 20 kilometers per hour or more. What slowly emerged from all this was something that resembled, in its final form, a living organism, far more than the rigid, compartmentalized armies of the previous generation. When everything worked as intended, and it must be noted that this was not always the case, a panzer division operated with an flexibility and responsiveness that was genuinely remarkable for the time. Commanders on the ground made decisions and saw them executed within minutes. Artillery fire could shift as the situation changed. Air support could be called in when needed. Infantry could follow the armor through breakthroughs. The whole formation could wheel and shift direction in response to developing opportunities or emerging threats. None of this happened automatically. It required constant training, constant refinement, constant adjustment of procedures and practices. It required officers and men to think beyond the rigid hierarchies and compartmentalized responsibilities of traditional military organization. It required a kind of trust between different branches, tankers trusting that infantry would follow them into breakthroughs, infantrymen trusting that armor would protect them, artillerymen and airmen trusting that they would receive clear and timely information about where they were needed. And it required something that military organizations rarely possessed, a willingness to learn from failure and to admit that existing practices might need to be radically reimagined. The result was not, as later mythology would sometimes suggest, a perfect and irresistible machine. It was often ragged around the edges, communications frequently broke down, supplies lagged, units became lost or disorganized, but at its core, there was a coherence and a coordination that set it apart from what other armies of the time were attempting. And that coordination, that integrated thinking about how different weapons and different soldiers might work together, was perhaps the most fundamental innovation of what would become known as Blitzkrieg. Now, as the panzer theorists began their work across the 1920s and into the 1930s, there emerged alongside them another quiet conversation, one that would prove equally essential to the whole machinery of Schwerpunkt. It concerned the sky itself. You see, the doctrine taking shape in those German officer schools was fundamentally about concentration, about taking the maximum force and driving it through a single point of weakness at precisely the moment that weakness could no longer be defended. But there was an old problem embedded in this thinking. Ground forces, no matter how mobile, no matter how well coordinated, still faced the limitation of terrain. A river could slow them, a fortified position could halt them, an enemy reserve, arriving from another sector, could blunt their thrust. And so the question that began to whisper through certain circles was this: what if the air itself became an extension of that concentrated blow? The Luftwaffe, Germany's reborn air force, emerged officially only in 1935, when rearmament was openly embraced. But the seeds of its strategic marriage to ground forces had been planted much earlier, in those semi-secret discussions and theoretical papers that circulated among officers who understood what was being attempted on the ground. The connection was not immediately obvious to everyone. Many nations still viewed air power as either a tool for achieving air superiority, shooting down enemy aircraft, or as a means of striking distant industrial targets. But within German military circles, a different intuition was taking hold. What if aircraft could become, in essence, flying guns integrated into the ground commander's arsenal? What if they could strike not at factories hundreds of kilometers away, but at the precise point where the enemy line was about to break? This was a revolutionary thought, though not one without precedent. During the First World War, pilots had experimented with supporting ground troops directly, strafing trenches and bombing immediate targets just ahead of advancing infantry. But those efforts had been fragmented, uncoordinated, almost accidental in their nature. What the emerging German doctrine imagined was something far more systematic. The dive bomber became the philosophical center of this vision. Think for a moment about the ordinary bomb dropped from altitude. It falls somewhat randomly, spreads its effect across a wide area. A tactical tool, yes, but an imprecise one when you needed precision. But a dive bomber, an aircraft that descended steeply toward its target, releasing ordnance from low altitude before pulling up sharply, could place explosive force with remarkable accuracy. It could, in theory, become a flying artillery piece, and not merely artillery, but artillery that could be positioned, repositioned, and redeployed with a flexibility that ground-based guns could never quite achieve. The Junkers Ju-87, the Stuka, that angular, fixed-gear aircraft with the inverted gull wing that would become so iconic in the public imagination, was not yet in production during these theoretical years. But the concept behind it was being refined, shaped by this understanding that air power and ground power needed to become one coordinated system. Early aircraft designs were tested, modified, discussed in quiet meetings. The technical challenges were substantial. A dive bomber needed to be robust enough to withstand the tremendous stresses of steep descent and abrupt pullout. It needed to carry enough ordnance to be meaningful against ground targets. It needed to be reasonably maneuverable, though not necessarily fast by air combat standards. And crucially, it needed to be survivable against anti-aircraft fire, because if it was to operate close to the front line, in support of advancing troops, it would face considerable defensive opposition. What emerges from the historical record is a picture of Luftwaffe development that was, in many ways, fundamentally different from how other nations were building their air forces. The British were designing long-range bombers meant to penetrate deep into enemy territory. The Soviets were developing fighter aircraft and ground attack planes, but without necessarily the same integrated doctrine. The Germans, by contrast, were thinking operationally. They were asking how air power could be woven into the larger tapestry of mobile warfare, how aviation could serve the same strategic purpose as the concentrated panzer thrust. By the early 1930s, a figure emerged who would become central to this integration. Ernst Udet, a decorated pilot from the First World War and a man of considerable technical skill and political acumen, became increasingly involved in shaping Luftwaffe doctrine. Udet, like many officers transitioning from the old Imperial Air Service to the new Luftwaffe, carried with him intuitions about what aviation could accomplish. He became a champion, alongside others in the Air Force leadership, of the dive-bombing concept. The idea appealed to him viscerally. It was aggressive, it was precise, it was German in its ruthless efficiency. Picture, if you will, a Luftwaffe staff meeting in the mid-1930s, officers gathered around maps and aircraft specifications, discussing not just how many bombers Germany should build, but what those bombers should do, where they should be positioned, and, most importantly, how they should coordinate with the army's movements. This was the integration of arms at a conceptual level, long before it could be tested in actual combat, and the conversation kept returning to this idea. the Air Force, as the Army's concentrated striking tool, operating just ahead of the ground forces, clearing obstacles, breaking enemy formations, preventing reserves from arriving at the critical point. Consider the potential of this approach from a tactical standpoint. An enemy defensive line, even a reasonably well-prepared one, could be softened, devastated even, by intensive airstrikes arriving with precision timing, the anti-aircraft defenses in any given sector, being distributed along the line, would be relatively thin at any one point. A concentrated air effort against that weak point, arriving just as the Panzer spearhead approached, could overwhelm the local defenders. The psychological impact alone, the sudden appearance of screaming dive bombers directly overhead, would be tremendous. And the physical damage would prevent enemy artillery from being repositioned to counter the ground attack. This was, in its essence, an extension of Schwerpunkt itself. The concentrated point of effort was no longer merely a ground phenomenon. It had a vertical component. The attack would come from the ground and from the sky simultaneously, overwhelming defenders not just through physical force, but through the coordination of multiple vectors of assault that could not be easily defended against in their entirety. The technical development of the Stuka, then, must be understood not merely as aircraft engineering, but as doctrine made manifest in metal and fuel and explosive ordnance. Every feature of the aircraft was, in some sense, an expression of this theory. The accuracy of the dive bomber was the physical embodiment of the principle of concentrated force. The close coordination required between air and ground units was the organizational expression of combined arms thinking. The aircraft was, quite literally, flying Schwerpunkt. And as the 1930s progressed, the Luftwaffe began to develop the organizational structures and training protocols to make this vision real. Formation flying became standardized. Radio communication between air and ground units was developed. Liaison officers were embedded in Army headquarters to coordinate air support requests. Supply systems were designed to keep dive bombers operational close to the front lines. The Luftwaffe, in other words, was not simply acquiring aircraft. It was building a system, a coordinated whole that integrated air and ground power. This was, it should be noted, relatively novel in the international military context. The British and French still largely separated their air forces from their armies, treating them as somewhat independent instruments. The Soviets were experimenting with integration, but on a scale and with an intensity that was quite different from the German approach. The Germans, constrained by Versailles and then operating under the early rearmament budgets, had the luxury of smaller numbers and were forced to think carefully about how to make every aircraft count. This constraint, paradoxically, perhaps encouraged a more sophisticated integrated doctrine. As the decade moved toward its end, as political tensions rose and the prospect of conflict grew closer, the Luftwaffe's role in Schwerpunkt thinking became ever more central. The dive bomber squadrons trained intensively. Mock exercises were conducted. Pilots and ground controllers practiced the coordination that would be required. And in the minds of the German High Command, a picture was forming of how the next war would be fought, not as the last war had been fought, across trenches and static lines, but as a dynamic, coordinated assault where tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft would move and strike as one organism, concentrated at the decisive point, irresistible. The theoretical frameworks that had been built in shadow through the 20s now found themselves suddenly thrust into the light of political reality. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, the military establishment that had been quietly perfecting its doctrine of concentrated maneuver found itself facing an entirely new circumstance. The legal restrictions of Versailles, which had constrained German rearmament into clandestine workshops and foreign proving grounds, could now be openly cast aside. The Reichswehr, as it was still called, began a transformation that would accelerate with each passing month, moving from theoretical elegance into the machinery of actual war preparation. Think of it as the moment when a musician who has been composing in solitude suddenly has an entire orchestra placed at their disposal. The doctrine that had been refined through intellectual rigor now needed to be scaled, tested, and woven into the actual capabilities of an expanding military apparatus. What made this period so consequential was not simply that rearmament was happening, many nations were rearming in the 1930s, but rather that Germany possessed a coherent philosophy about how to wage war that was distinctly at odds with the prevailing assumptions of its potential adversaries. While French military planners were still building concrete fortifications and thinking in terms of defensive lines and attrition, the German officer corps was maturing a doctrine that saw mobility and concentration as the path to breaking an enemy before mutual exhaustion set in. The resources that became available after 1933 allowed this doctrine to move from the realm of study into the realm of structure. Tank production increased dramatically. The Luftwaffe, which had scarcely existed in official form before, began to take on institutional weight and coherence. Infantry organization was reformed to work in concert with armor. Communications equipment, particularly radios, began to proliferate through the command structure in ways that would have been impossible during the lean years of the 20s. Yet it is worth pausing here to understand what was actually being built during these rearmament years. The process was not one of implementing a finished blueprint. Rather, it was a continuous dialogue between the theoretical understanding that had been developed and the practical constraints of industrial production, resource scarcity, and political pressure. German industry, despite the enormous expansion of capacity in the mid-30s, still operated under significant constraints. Raw materials had to be carefully managed. The economy was being pushed toward military production while still attempting to maintain some semblance of civilian consumption. There was often friction between what the theorists imagined and what the economy could actually deliver. The panzer divisions that would later seem so formidable in historical memory were, in fact, often assembled from whatever tank designs had proven practical and producible, rather than representing the pinnacle of some grand strategic vision. What was genuinely new during these years was the willingness to invest organizational effort into actually implementing the insights about concentrated maneuver that had been developed during the restricted period. The divisional organization began to shift. Panzer divisions were being created as coherent units combining tanks, motorized infantry, reconnaissance elements, and dedicated support. The notion that tanks should operate as independent units scattered along a line of infantry, still the prevailing assumption in many other armies, was being systematically rejected. Instead, armor was being gathered into substantial formations designed to achieve breakthrough at a selected point. Artillery was being integrated into mobile formations rather than remaining anchored to fixed positions. Does this not suggest a fundamentally different conception of how modern warfare might unfold? The implications were substantial, even if few observers outside Germany seemed to grasp them fully at the time. The Luftwaffe's development during this period reveals another dimension of the maturing doctrine. Aircraft had not featured prominently in the theoretical discussions of the 20s because Germany had been forbidden from possessing a military air force under Versailles. Once that restriction was lifted and aircraft production began in earnest, there was a question about how these new capabilities should be integrated with ground operations. The prevailing view in most air forces was that aviation should pursue an independent strategic role, bombing enemy industry and cities from above. But German planners, shaped by their emphasis on concentration and the decisive point, began to conceive of aircraft in a different role. Dive bombers, in particular, captured the imagination as a way of delivering concentrated force from above. The Stukas, those distinctive gull-winged aircraft with their screaming dive, were imagined not as strategic bombers, but as airborne artillery, meant to suppress enemy positions and create the conditions for breakthrough at the point of concentration. This reflected the same philosophy that governed ground operations: find the weak point, concentrate everything available at that location, and achieve a decisive local victory that unravels the enemy's entire position. The problem-solving that occurred during the rearmament years also touched on matters of coordination and communication. If a doctrine of concentrated maneuver was to work in practice, the various elements, tanks, motorized infantry, supporting artillery, and aircraft, had to be able to coordinate their actions in ways that previous armies had rarely attempted. This is where radio technology became genuinely crucial, moving from being a luxury to being something close to essential. German military planners invested in equipping command vehicles and tanks with radios, creating what might be thought of as a nervous system running through the mobile formations. This required not just the technology itself, but also new training regimens, new communications protocols, and a cultural shift within the officer corps toward thinking of command in terms of coordinated action across distances. The senior officer sitting in a tank or half-track, communicating by radio with his subordinates, was a fundamentally different command model than the general surveying the battlefield from a fixed position or relying on messengers and telephone lines running back to headquarters. Throughout the mid to late 30s, as these organizational and technical changes were unfolding, there were also more subtle shifts in military culture and doctrine. Officers who understood the theoretical frameworks developed during the 20s were now in positions to shape training and organizational structure. Heinz Guderian, who had been studying the possibilities of mobile warfare and learning from British theorists, became increasingly influential in shaping how panzer formations were conceived and trained. The military journals that had been quietly exploring infiltration tactics and the possibilities of maneuver now began to influence official doctrine in more direct ways. Joint exercises involving tanks, motor vehicles, and aircraft began to reveal what was possible when these elements worked in concert. These exercises were not without problems or failures, but they reinforced the basic conviction that the traditional line-based, attrition-focused approach to warfare was not the only path available. It is perhaps tempting to see this period as one of seamless development, where everything moved logically toward the mature doctrine that would be tested in Poland and France. But that would be to impose a false clarity on what was actually a more complex and contested process. There were disagreements about resource allocation. Some officers remained skeptical about the emphasis on mobile armor. Questions persisted about whether Germany could actually sustain rapid mobile warfare given its resource constraints. Yet what is undeniable is that by the late 1930s, Germany possessed a military structure that was organized around principles fundamentally different from those governing most other major armies. The doctrine had moved from being the possession of a small circle of innovative thinkers to being embedded in organizational structures, training regimens, and equipment design. The theoretical insights about concentration of force at a decisive point, the integration of different types of units into mobile formations, and the coordination of armor with air support had all begun to take on institutional weight. The rearmament years also meant that Germany's military planning could become increasingly aggressive in ambition. During the 20s and early 30s, when the Reichswehr was small and constrained, the strategic thinking had often been defensive or focused on containing a potential threat from Poland or the Soviet Union. But as rearmament accelerated and the military apparatus grew, the strategic possibilities began to expand. The doctrine of concentrated maneuver that had been developed partly in response to the constraints of a small army now became something that might enable a relatively smaller military force to punch above its apparent weight, to defeat opponents that seemed numerically superior through superior organization and coordination. This was not without significance for the political leadership, which could now contemplate military adventures that would have seemed fantastical only a few years earlier. The doctrine, in other words, was not simply a military matter, but had political consequences as well. When political leaders believe they possess a military method that can achieve quick victories through concentrated force and breakthrough, they may be more inclined to take military risks than if their only option appeared to be grinding attrition. The German rearmament years thus represented a period in which the intellectual and theoretical work of the previous decade was being translated into institutional reality, equipment, organization, and training. The doctrine of Schwerpunkt The idea of concentrated force at the decisive point was no longer simply a subject of discussion in military journals and the studies of innovative officers. It was becoming the organizing principle of how the German military was actually structured. The question that remained unanswered, as these years of rearmament drew toward their conclusion, was how this doctrine would perform when tested against actual opponents in actual warfare. Would the theoretical elegance survive contact with reality? Would the coordination that had been practiced in exercises and maneuvers actually be achieved when facing an enemy determined to disrupt and prevent exactly that kind of concentration? These were questions that could not be answered in the rearmament years themselves. They could only be answered through the test of actual war. And so in the years when the new German state was finding its footing, when factories began to hum again and rearmament crept forward behind careful veils of secrecy, a peculiar opportunity emerged from the smoke of another nation's internal conflict. In Spain, in 1936, a civil war broke open between those who wished to preserve the Republic and those who sought to overturn it. And into this distant struggle, Germany saw something it had long been searching for, a testing ground, where doctrine could meet reality, where theory could be measured against actual fire, beyond the gaze of international scrutiny. The nationalist forces under Francisco Franco sought aid, and Hitler, recognizing both a strategic opening and a chance to observe his own military innovations under combat conditions, sent aircraft and crews to support them. This expeditionary force, called the Condor Legion, became Germany's secret laboratory. Some 400 pilots, nearly 200 aircraft, and technical personnel moved quietly to Spain, their uniforms unmarked, their purpose officially deniable. They came not as invaders, but as volunteers, a fiction that allowed Germany to test its emerging air power while maintaining the thin facade of neutrality in the eyes of the world. And what they carried with them were the newest fighters, the Messerschmitt 109, still raw and untested in sustained combat, the Heinkel 111 bomber, the Junkers 87 Stuka, that infamous dive bomber with its fixed landing gear and its screaming siren. For nearly 3 years, from 36 to 39, these men flew and fought in Spain, and their experiences became precious data flowing back to the German High Command. The questions they answered were not abstract. Could single-engine fighters outmaneuver biplanes in sustained dogfight? How did an engine perform at altitude in the thin Spanish air? What happened to aircraft when they took hits from anti-aircraft fire? How did formations of bombers actually behave when escorted by fighters? What psychological effect did the dive bomber's shriek have on troops below? These were the granular, technical questions that separated theory from survival, and every pilot who returned brought lessons written in his own narrow escapes and his comrades' losses. What emerged from this Spanish crucible was something quieter, but perhaps more important than spectacular victories. The Luftwaffe learned that the doctrine of area bombing, spreading attacks across wide zones, was far less effective than concentrated strikes against specific targets. A bombing campaign meant to terrorize was often met with defiant resistance, yet a coordinated assault on a particular position, a specific bridge, a narrow point in a defensive line, achieved disproportionate results. The principle of Schwerpunkt, that concentrated focal point of effort, was proving itself not merely in theory, but in actual operations. The lesson was absorbed almost unconsciously by commanders in the field, fed back into doctrine, reinforced by after-action reports that circulated quietly through briefing rooms in Berlin. The pilots themselves, many of them destined for command roles later in the war, internalized something even more significant. They began to understand, through the aching logic of survival, that air power could not simply operate as an independent force divorced from the ground war unfolding below. When a Stuka dove on a target, it needed fighter protection. When bombers flew in formation, they needed reconnaissance to find their targets and fighters to shield them from enemy interceptors. When the ground forces pushed forward and a defensive line collapsed, aircraft could exploit that breakthrough if they were coordinated with the advancing columns below. The Spanish Air War became a slow, grueling education in the marriage of air and ground forces. There was too a darker lesson, one that cast a long shadow forward. The raids on towns like Guernica in 1937, where German bombers participated in attacks on civilian populations, demonstrated something the High Command noted with clinical interest, that bombing cities did not necessarily break civilian will or produce rapid military victory. The town burned, the Basque center was devastated, and yet the war continued. Spanish Republicans fought on. This observation, filed away in German archives, would prove fateful in later years when the Luftwaffe would face the challenge of breaking Britain through aerial bombardment, carrying forward the mistaken assumption that bombing cities could deliver quick strategic collapse. Radio communication, too, received crucial testing in Spain. German bombers and fighters were equipped with radio, which gave them a nervous system unlike anything Spain's Republican forces possessed. Pilots could receive directions from ground control, could relay information about enemy positions, could coordinate their movements in real time rather than simply following prearranged plans. This advantage, so modest seeming in a Spanish valley, would compound into something far more significant when applied to the vast theaters of Poland and France. The invisible web of radio waves binding pilot to ground, linking different squadrons, allowing a commander to shift forces with instant orders. This would become one of the great invisible weapons of Blitzkrieg, as important in some ways as the tanks themselves. The panzer officers who came to Spain learned lessons of their own. Tanks in the Spanish conflict, though used in relatively small numbers, revealed certain truths about armored warfare. A tank alone, unsupported by infantry moving alongside it, was vulnerable to coordinated anti-tank fire and to infantry carrying anti-tank weapons. Armor needed to move with the infantry, who would clear the ground ahead of it, and both needed to move under the umbrella of aircraft overhead striking enemy positions just before the ground assault rolled forward. The Spanish crucible taught what seemed like obvious lessons to those who watched carefully, yet these lessons were not obvious to commanders across Europe who remained wedded to older forms of warfare. And what of the pilots themselves, the young men who flew dive bombers and fighters in Spanish skies? Many survived and returned to Germany carrying hard-won expertise. Günther Lützow, Werner Mölders, Hannes Balthasar, names that would become legendary in the Luftwaffe, in some cases tragic ones, flew in Spain and learned skills that would define air combat in the coming years. They learned how to use the sun as concealment, how to approach enemy formations unseen, how to break off an attack at the precise moment to avoid ground fire. They learned, through trial and terrible error, the difference between what the test range suggested and what the chaos of actual combat revealed. More than 100 German pilots were killed in Spain, an unremarkable number on its surface, yet each death purchased experience that would inform doctrine and training for the larger war approaching on the horizon. By the time Germany's forces swept into Poland in 1939, then wheeled westward toward France in 1940, the Spanish campaign had already become history, its lessons absorbed into the sinews and synapses of the military machine. No official proclamation announced these lessons. There was no grand moment where commanders gathered and announced that Spain had proven the doctrine of concentrated force, had validated the marriage of air and ground warfare, had demonstrated the irreplaceable value of radio-coordinated movement. Instead, the lessons seeped into operational planning, like water into soil, informing decisions about how to organize formations, how to train pilots, how to deploy armor, how to time offensives. The Schwerpunkt Doctrine that had emerged from theory in the 1920s had been tested and refined in Spain's brutal and distant proving ground, and it had emerged stronger, more confident, more lethal in its precision. The Spanish earth had become the midwife to the Blitzkrieg that would soon transform Europe. When the German army crossed the Polish border on the first day of September in 1939, in the pre-dawn hours, when the air still carried the coolness of late summer, something in the character of warfare itself shifted irreversibly. The doctrine that had been sketched in theory through 2 decades of quiet, forbidden study now met its first true test against a living opponent across an actual landscape. The panzers rolled forward, and for the first time in modern history, the concentration of force, the Schwerpunkt, was deployed not as a concept discussed in Berlin staff colleges, but as thousands of tons of steel moving in coordinated swiftness toward predetermined objectives. The Polish military, for all its courage and its officers' understanding of honor and duty, had been constructed for a different kind of war. Their divisions were spread relatively evenly along an extended frontier, a defensive posture that made sense if one expected an enemy to attack methodically, division by division, grinding forward as armies had done in the previous war. This was, in many ways, the most natural assumption. How else, after all, would wars be fought? And yet the German approach was built precisely on the violation of that assumption. The Panzer Corps that drove through Poland, the 1st and 4th Panzer armies under commanders like Heinz Guderian himself, who had spent the previous years writing memoranda, studying British tank theorists, and wrestling with the limitations of limited resources. These forces were designed to find the spaces between enemy formations, rather than to attack them head-on. Can you sense the difference? The old way was to gather your strength and strike where the enemy was strongest, to prove your superiority through attrition. The new way was to find where the enemy was weakest, or even better, where the enemy simply was not yet positioned to defend, and exploit that opening with overwhelming speed before the defender could reinforce or reorganize. The Polish campaign lasted 37 days. In less than 6 weeks, a nation that had existed as an independent state for barely 2 decades was partitioned and defeated. The speed was astonishing to observers across Europe. The German advance averaged perhaps 25 kilometers per day in some sectors, a figure that sounds modest until one considers the challenges of maintaining supply lines, coordinating air support, and ensuring that follow-up infantry divisions could keep pace with the racing spearheads. But the doctrine allowed for this orchestration. The panzer divisions did not need to pause and consolidate. They simply kept moving through the spaces their own momentum had created, while the Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers provided what amounted to flying artillery that could be called to strike enemy defensive positions that lay ahead of the advancing columns. What is it about a weak point in a military line that becomes irresistible once it is recognized? In Poland, those weak points appeared everywhere, almost inevitably, because no army could defend everywhere simultaneously. The Germans had perhaps 2,000 tanks and armored vehicles available for the campaign, a figure that by later standards seems almost quaint. The Polish forces were larger in total manpower, yet they could not be everywhere. When a panzer spearhead punched through a sector of the line, the breakthrough was not followed by a pause to consolidate the ground or to wait for flanking forces to catch up. Instead, the breakthrough became the point of commitment. More reserves, more fuel, more air support, everything flowed into widening that rupture. The Polish army found itself fractured into isolated pockets, its command and communication structures disrupted by the speed of events, unable to form a cohesive defense because the battlefield itself was becoming too fluid to defend in the traditional sense. The cavalry charges of Polish mounted regiments against German armor, those images that would burn themselves into historical memory as symbols of futile courage against mechanical modernity, emerged precisely because the Polish command structure, at lower levels, was trying to respond to threats that had already moved elsewhere by the time a response was mounted. An order to counterattack a panzer spearhead took time to communicate down through the chain of command. In that interval, the spearhead had advanced further, had called for air support, had been reinforced. The counterattack was mounted against an enemy that was no longer in that location, or worse, was being engaged by forces that had themselves been behind the spearhead minutes before. The doctrine was working. The theory had proven itself viable at operational scale. Panzer divisions cooperating with infantry, with artillery, with aircraft, the whole system moving at a tempo that the enemy simply could not match, because the enemy was trying to fight a war that required deliberation, consolidation, and reorganization at each step. The Germans had designed a system that moved faster than deliberation. The oscillation between thought and action, the time it took for observation to become decision, to become execution, was shorter in the German system because it had been intentionally engineered that way. What does it mean for a defending army when it realizes that the war is being fought at a speed it cannot match? In the Polish campaign, that realization seems to have come slowly, or perhaps too late. Pockets of fierce resistance continued throughout the campaign, and the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces advanced from the other direction, saw bitter fighting in some sectors, even after the German victory was essentially decided. But the fundamental answer to the question of whether this new doctrine could work, whether the theory of concentrated force applied through rapid maneuver could actually defeat a modern military, had already been answered within the first week. Observe how the Wehrmacht began to accumulate confidence, not hubris exactly, but a sense that they had found a way to wage warfare that was fundamentally superior to what their enemies could devise in response. The panzer crews that would face the French 2 months later, the reserves now being positioned to face British intervention, the general staff beginning to plan the next operations. All of these now possessed not just the theory, but the proven experience that Schwerpunkt, concentrated force, delivered at speed and at a chosen point, could shatter the conventional deployment of a modern army. The Polish campaign was devastating in its brevity, precisely because it answered a question that had been theoretical: could the new doctrine actually work? And on some level, the fact that it had worked so decisively meant that the entire character of European warfare in the next phase was already being written, even as the dust was still settling on Polish territory. By the spring of 1940, the German officer corps had been rehearsing their doctrine in theory for nearly 2 decades, turning it over and over in staff colleges and military journals, sketching it on maps in darkened rooms. But Poland had given them only a glimpse of what was possible. The French campaign would become the canvas where Schwerpunkt truly painted itself across the landscape of Europe. And in the quiet of the night, when a listener might reflect on how ideas become flesh and blood, it is worth following the path that those armoured columns took through the Ardennes. The common assumption before May 1940 was that the German army would repeat the Schlieffen Plan, that great circular sweeping motion that had nearly broken France a quarter-century earlier. The French High Command, led by General Maurice Gamelin, had arranged their defences accordingly. Their strongest fortifications and their most experienced divisions deployed along the Belgian frontier, where the expected blow would fall. This is where the weight was supposed to come down. This is where they prepared to meet it. But Schwerpunkt, in its essence, teaches us something far more subtle than merely hitting the enemy where he is strongest. It teaches us to find the decisive point, the place where victory becomes possible, and to concentrate everything, not evenly, but with an almost reckless intensity, at that single location. The Ardennes, dense with forest and carved with ravines, was considered nearly impassable for a modern army relying on mechanized armor. Military theorists had looked at those twisted roads and decided they were the domain of foot soldiers and cavalry, not tanks. The French had accordingly left that sector lightly defended, holding it with second-rate reserve divisions and cavalry units that were by this point almost anachronisms in a mechanized war. And here, in this apparent impossibility, Heinz Guderian and his staff saw not an obstacle, but an invitation. This is where the decisive point lay. This is where the defense could be broken not by weight of numbers along the whole front, but by a perfectly aimed thrust that would unbalance everything. In the early hours of May 10th, German forces launched their offensive along multiple fronts. To the north, mechanized columns swept into Belgium and Holland, exactly where the French expected them. Generals and politicians in Paris watched with grim satisfaction as their armies began moving to meet what seemed to be the anticipated assault. The bait was taken, the trap was set. But simultaneously, a vast, serpentine column of panzer divisions and motorized infantry, a force numbering nearly 2,000 vehicles, began threading its way through the Ardennes toward the Meuse River. The column stretched for miles, a mechanical python moving through the forest, and the officers commanding it knew that the speed of their advance mattered more than its concealment. Surprise was already built into the audacity of the approach itself. What strikes us now, in the quietness of hindsight, is how thin the German logistics became during this crossing. They were not overwhelming in number. The notion of German numerical superiority on the ground is one of the war's persistent myths. What they possessed instead was concentration, coordination, and a willingness to accept risk. The forward panzer regiments advanced sometimes 100 miles ahead of their supply lines, their fuel trucks struggling to keep pace through narrow roads where vehicles occasionally collided in the darkness. There was something almost reckless about it, and yet it worked, because it was precisely this tempo that the French command structure could not match. By the time reports reached Gamelin's headquarters that German tanks were approaching the Meuse in strength, the decision had already been made to commit the bulk of French reserves to the north. The nerve center of French command was reacting to the northern offensive as if it were the main attack. It was not. On May 12th, as German reconnaissance elements reached the Meuse near Sedan, they found themselves facing a defense that was capable but not overwhelming. The French had good artillery, experienced officers in many cases, but they lacked the density of defense that might have held such a crossing against the oncoming assault. Consider for a moment what happened in those hours between the 12th and the 14th of May. The Germans did not attempt to cross at points of maximum strength. Instead, they carefully identified weak sections of the riverbank where local forces were thinnest, where a sudden concentration of fire could suppress the defenders long enough for bridging operations to begin. This was Schwerpunkt applied to a river crossing. Not everywhere equally, but exactly where it mattered most. The Luftwaffe, that component of combined arms which had evolved from the doctrine of concentrated force in the sky, provided something no military arm had offered before, what we might almost call flying artillery for the crossing. Dive bombers screamed down on French positions, not in loose formations, but in concentrated patterns designed to suppress and demoralize, to create a psychological breach that would complement the physical one being forced below. French artillery, which might have been devastating if coordinated and concentrated, instead found itself scattered across a large front, responding to emergencies across multiple sectors, and thus devastating nowhere. Does this not reveal something about how doctrine operates? It is not merely about what you do, but about forcing your enemy into a posture where they cannot bring their strength to bear on your point of weakness. By May 14th, crossing sites had been secured, and bridging operations had begun in earnest. The German engineers, working under intense fire, threw temporary bridges across the Meuse, first pontoon bridges, then, as the bridgehead deepened, larger structures capable of supporting the heavier armor. And what is remarkable in the accounts of those who lived through it is the compressed timescale. The French defenders, in many cases, fought with courage and tactical skill, but they were reactive rather than proactive. Commands and countercommands flowed upward and downward through a chain of command that seemed somehow too rigid, too slow, for what was unfolding. By contrast, German panzer commanders in the field exercised substantial autonomy, pushing forward, committing reserves locally, adapting to opportunity. The doctrine's emphasis on trained judgment at lower levels meant that the command structure could be lean and fast. Once the Meuse was crossed, the armored columns accelerated northwestward toward the Channel coast. This is where the doctrine truly revealed its geometric power. With the main French reserves committed to fighting in Belgium and Holland, and with the German breakthrough happening at a point where French command had thought no breakthrough possible, the entire left flank of the French army became increasingly exposed. Successive waves of German mechanized forces poured through the breach, not attempting to destroy the French army piece by piece, which would have taken far longer and consumed vast resources, but instead racing to cut off its lines of supply and retreat. The goal was not to kill every French soldier, but to render the army unable to function as a cohesive force. There is something almost mathematically elegant about how a concentrated thrust delivered at precisely the right moment and place, can unbalance a far more diffuse defense. The French army at the moment of the German offensive was perhaps slightly stronger in raw numbers, and certainly more experienced in many respects, and yet within weeks it was broken. This was not because German soldiers were inherently superior, or because German equipment was uniformly better. It was because the doctrine of Schwerpunkt had been refined through years of study, tested in Poland, and now deployed with a precision that seemed almost to defy what warfare was supposed to be. Where was the grinding attrition? Where was the stalemate? Instead, there was this rapid, almost fluid movement that left defenders struggling to catch up with events. By June 22nd, France had signed an armistice. The campaign had lasted just over 6 weeks, and in the aftermath, as German officers reviewed what had been accomplished, they could see that the doctrine had proven itself in the largest trial yet. Schwerpunkt, that idea of finding the decisive point and concentrating overwhelming force there, supported by all available means, coordinated through rapid communication, executed with willingness to accept risk, had shattered a defensive posture that had been thought impregnable just weeks before. And yet, it is here, in the moment after the thunder has rolled across Europe, in the pause between triumph and the slow recognition of limits, that we must sit with something that has troubled historians ever since. The word itself, Blitzkrieg, did not emerge from some master blueprint drawn up in a Berlin General Staff office. It was not, as the mythology has so persistently suggested, a perfectly engineered war machine that descended upon the continent with mathematical inevitability. Instead, what happened was something altogether more fragile, more human, more dependent on circumstance and audacity than the clean narratives of either German propaganda or later post-war scholarship would have us believe. Consider what we know now, what the documents and the testimonies of those who lived it have gradually revealed to us. When the panzer divisions rolled eastward into Poland, when the spearheads found their way through the Ardennes, when the dive bombers screamed down upon positions that had no adequate defense, there was less of a coordinated grand vision at work than there was a collection of improvised experiments, of commanders learning in real time what their machines and their men could do. The German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, was not operating from a settled doctrine that had been perfected over a decade of careful study. Rather, it was testing ideas that were still being refined, still being adapted, sometimes struggling against resource constraints that rarely made the headlines. The propagandists, of course, understood the power of a simple narrative. A word like blitzkrieg, lightning war, carries within it the suggestion of inevitability, of a perfect storm of technology and strategy crashing down upon unprepared enemies. It suggested that Germany had discovered some secret, some military philosopher's stone, that transmuted industrial capacity and manpower into swift, decisive victory. And because the early campaigns did unfold with surprising speed, because Polish defenses collapsed faster than anyone anticipated, because the French armoured reserves failed to concentrate where they were needed, the myth took hold. It was reinforced by German commanders themselves, who understood that success breeds confidence, and confidence breeds more success. But here is what the records show us, if we sit with them long enough. The Blitzkrieg was not a doctrine so much as a tendency, a direction of military thinking that seized upon mobility and concentration and threw it at problems as they arose. When panzer divisions outran their supply lines, they did not do so because it was part of the master plan. They did so because opportunities presented themselves, because the enemy's resistance was weaker than expected, because commanders like Guderian and Rommel possessed the audacity to exceed their orders. The Wehrmacht, for all its reputation, was not a smoothly oiled machine. It was an organization struggling with the constraints of a nation that could not simply manufacture unlimited tanks, that did not have the industrial base of the Soviet Union or America, that was constantly improvising. Think for a moment about what happened in the campaigns themselves. In Poland, the panzer divisions achieved penetration not because the doctrine was perfected, but because the Polish army was unprepared for the sheer pace of it. They had trained for a 19th century kind of war, and here came something new, something faster. But would that same approach have worked against a fully mobilized enemy with reserves in depth and the capacity to absorb losses? The question lingers, unresolved, because the circumstances never quite allowed for a true test against an opponent prepared in the way that, say, the Soviet Union would eventually prove to be. The France campaign in 1940 deepens the mystery still. The Ardennes crossing was audacious, yes, and it worked magnificently. But it worked in part because the French High Command made choices that compounded the vulnerability. It worked because the speed of events outpaced the ability of the French defense to respond, not necessarily because the Germans had unlocked some perfect system of combined arms. The German losses were severe. The strain on supplies was constant. The Luftwaffe, for all its apparent dominance, was stretched thin. After the victory, there was no simple consolidation, no smooth transition to the next phase. Instead, there was a desperate improvisation of logistics, a scrambling to maintain momentum against forces that were never quite as broken as the victory suggested. And here lies a truth that the historians have only gradually, almost reluctantly, come to acknowledge. The Blitzkrieg worked in specific contexts, against specific opponents, at specific moments in time. It was not a universally applicable doctrine, so much as a powerful idea that achieved remarkable success when the conditions aligned. When those conditions changed, when the enemy had depth, when the distances became vast, when the winters came, the doctrine revealed itself to be less a complete military system than a brilliant but ultimately limited approach to using the technology and methods that were available. The myth grew particularly in the decades after the war. German officers, writing their memoirs, had every reason to portray their campaigns as the unfolding of a coherent strategy. It was psychologically easier to explain defeat as the result of attacking an enemy that was ultimately too large, too resourced, too vast to overcome through brilliance alone. And on the Allied side, historians and military theorists were eager to understand how Germany had so nearly conquered Europe. So they looked backward and found, or rather, they constructed, a doctrine that seemed to explain it all. A perfect strategy, they suggested, executed by brilliant commanders, undone only by the weight of numbers and the turning of the seasons. But what if we pause here, in this quieter moment, and sit with a different understanding? What if Blitzkrieg was less a grand doctrine that was devised and then executed, and more a way of thinking about warfare that emerged from the conditions of the Eastern Front, that was refined through study and practice, that achieved remarkable success when its particular virtues aligned with the weaknesses of its opponents? What if it was, in other words, more fragile than the mythology suggested, more dependent on circumstances, more improvised even in its moments of apparent perfection? The tanks and the aircraft, the radio communications and the coordinated attacks, the maneuver and the concentration of force, all of these were real. The innovations were genuine. But the narrative of inevitability, the sense that Germany had unlocked the future of warfare and was simply waiting for the moment to unleash it, that was partly a construction, a story told afterward to make sense of what had happened. And in understanding this, in recognizing the gap between the myth and the reality, we arrive at something more truthful and, in its way, more sobering. The Blitzkrieg worked not because it was perfect, but because it was bold, because it seized upon an advantage at a moment when the enemy was unprepared to respond, because human beings made decisions and took risks that happened, for a time, to succeed. The strain, though, the constant strain, was always there beneath the surface. The resources were never quite sufficient. The doctrine had to bend and adapt with each new campaign, each new opponent, each new circumstance. And eventually, when it collided with an enemy that had the space to absorb the initial blow, that had the industrial capacity to recover, that had the numbers and the will to fight on, the doctrine began to lose its power. But by then, the myth was already so firmly established that it would take decades of careful historical work to disentangle what had actually happened from what people believed had happened. And so the field falls silent now. the shadows of that distant doctrine stretching long across the decades that followed. The soldiers have long departed, the tanks have rusted into monuments or museum pieces, and yet the idea they carried forward, that singular, focused application of overwhelming force at the decisive point, remains, quiet but present, in every military classroom and strategic think tank across the modern world. You might wonder, as the hour grows late and your own thoughts begin to drift, whether Schwerpunkt was truly forgotten or whether it simply changed names. The doctrine did not die in 1945 alongside the regime that wielded it. Instead, it transformed, was studied, was absorbed into the military lexicons of nations, both former allies and former adversaries alike. The Americans, who had fought so hard against it, found themselves increasingly interested in its architecture once the war had ended. Strategists began to ask quietly, what was it exactly that the German officer corps had understood that allowed them to move so decisively, to concentrate their forces with such precision, to find the weak point in the line and press through it with such coordinated purpose? The principle itself is older than any one nation's interpretation of it. Clausewitz knew it when he wrote of the decisive point. Napoleon understood it intuitively, that the greatest strength lies not in spreading your force evenly, but in gathering it in secret and striking where your opponent is weakest. But the Germans took that ancient wisdom and married it to industrial modernity, to radio communication, to combined arms coordination, to the mechanical capabilities of tanks and aircraft working in concert with infantry. They created, in essence, a philosophy of how to make concentrated force move and breathe and adapt in real time, how to keep your enemy off balance, not through endless waves of soldiers, but through the coordinated focus of every available tool toward a single objective. In the decades since, military theorists have watched this approach echo forward. The swift campaigns of the late 20th century, the rapid maneuver operations that came to define modern warfare, all carry the fingerprints of those interwar officers working in secret, of Guderian poring over tank manuals, of radio operators learning to coordinate across distances that had previously seemed impossibly vast. The notion that you should not engage an enemy across an entire front, but rather identify the point at which they are vulnerable and concentrate there, this remains, even now, central to how military forces think about movement and strategy. Yet there is something softer, something more subtle that persists as well. The German military tradition after the First World War was built on an assumption that quality could substitute for quantity, that a smaller force composed of highly trained, highly motivated, deeply educated soldiers could outthink and outmaneuver a larger but less coordinated adversary. This belief in the power of the professional, in the idea that strategic thinking itself is a kind of martial art that can be taught and refined through study and reflection, this too has echoed forward. Modern armies, particularly those with smaller budgets and smaller populations, often find themselves drawn back to this principle. Why field enormous standing armies if you can instead develop soldiers whose training is so thorough, whose understanding of mission and maneuver so complete, that they can accomplish more with less? The technological landscape has transformed dramatically, of course. The radio operators who once had to maintain line-of-sight communication through radio sets that were themselves works of engineering wonder now operate within networks of satellite communication, within digital command and control systems that would seem like pure fantasy to those interwar planners. But the fundamental principle remains recognizable. How do you coordinate complex movement? How do you concentrate force at the decisive point? How do you keep that concentrated force coherent and responsive even as it moves deeper into enemy territory? These questions persist. In some ways, Schwerpunkt Doctrine has become almost invisible precisely because it has been so thoroughly absorbed into modern military thinking. It is no longer attributed to any one nation or any one tradition. It has become part of the shared understanding of how professional militaries operate, like a fundamental law of motion that no longer needs to be named because it has simply become obvious. When a modern commander speaks of applying force asymmetrically, or of identifying lines of effort. They are speaking, perhaps without quite realizing it, in the language that was born in those secret studies of the Weimar years, in the writings of men who were trying to imagine how to think about war differently. Yet there is a paradox worth noting as your mind begins to settle, worth holding lightly before sleep carries the thought away entirely. The doctrine that was built on the idea of concentration, of focus, of identifying a single decisive point, this doctrine was also born out of constraint, out of the desperate need to find a way to think about military problems differently, because the old way had failed so catastrophically. The trench warfare of the First World War represented, in a sense, the complete rejection of concentrated force. Instead of a Schwerpunkt, there was a grinding line that stretched across an entire continent, a seemingly endless dispersal of effort across an impossibly wide front. The German officers who survived that war, who picked their way through the mud and the barbed wire and the machine gun fire, they learned something profound from that experience. They learned that concentration was not merely tactically efficient, but perhaps even morally necessary. To spend fewer lives achieving more was, in their view, not just militarily sound, but ethically superior to the old way of enormous casualties spread across an attempt to gain ground everywhere at once. This too persists in how modern militaries think about themselves, though it is often unexamined. The belief that the way to prevent catastrophic loss of life is through better thinking, through better organization, through the intelligent concentration of force, rather than the brute application of endless resources. Whether this belief is itself an illusion, whether it represents a genuine discovery about how to wage war more humanely, or merely a more sophisticated way of managing military violence, remains a question that thoughtful people continue to debate. But the belief itself, the assumption that lies beneath it, clearly descends in a direct line from those officers pondering how to rebuild German military thought from the ashes of 1918. The Spanish Civil War tested these ideas in ways that were sometimes brutal, sometimes revealing. The Luftwaffe pilots who flew support missions for the nationalist forces, they were learning, in real time, how to integrate aircraft with ground forces, how to use the sky as an extension of the battlefield, how to concentrate air power not randomly, but at the decisive point where ground forces were pressing forward. What they learned there was carried forward into later campaigns, refined and expanded and adapted to new circumstances. But the fundamental principle remained the same: coordinated concentration. Modern air campaigns, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere, still grapple with the same essential question that animated those Luftwaffe theorists. How do you use air power, not as a tool for area destruction, but as a precise, coordinated element of a larger combined arms effort? Sometimes the answer that emerges is that you cannot, that air power has its own logic that does not always integrate smoothly with ground maneuver. But the attempt to achieve that integration, to think of air power and ground power and logistics and intelligence as all moving toward a single Schwerpunkt, this remains a central concern of modern military planning. As the years have accumulated and new technologies have arrived, there has been a fascinating recurrence of these questions in new forms. When theorists began to think about cyber warfare, about information warfare, about the modern domain of electronic and digital conflict, they found themselves asking very similar questions to those that had preoccupied Guderian and his colleagues. Where is the decisive point? How do you concentrate effort in a domain where traditional notions of force and movement do not quite apply? How do you create coherence and coordination across systems that are increasingly complex and increasingly distributed? The language might be different, the technologies entirely new, but the underlying strategic problem is recognizably descended from the Schwerpunkt Doctrine. There is something poignant, perhaps, in noting that a doctrine born in defeat, born from the hard necessity of reimagining military theory under the constraints of the Treaty of Versailles, has proven so durable and so influential. The officers of the Reichswehr could not have imagined the technological landscape of the 21st century, yet the way they thought about problems, the emphasis on quality over quantity, on coordination and professionalism, on the identification and concentration of effort at decisive points. These ways of thinking have survived and adapted. They have become part of the language through which military institutions worldwide think about their own operations. And perhaps this is fitting. Great ideas, when they are truly great, when they are built on genuine insights into how things work, tend to survive the regimes that birth them. The idea that concentrated, coordinated force is more effective than dispersed, uncoordinated force. This is not an idea unique to any one nation or any one moment in history, but the German military thinkers of the 1920s and 1930s found a particular way of expressing it, of operationalizing it, of teaching it, that proved remarkably generative. Other nations, other militaries, could adapt and learn from it without necessarily adopting the political context in which it initially arose. The field around you has grown even quieter now, the mist thickening as the hours grow later still. If you were to walk across that training ground where the Reichswehr soldiers once practiced their maneuvers, you would find it empty and overgrown. The fortifications are gone or crumbled. The vehicles have all been